We are now.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to call this meeting of January 26th, 2022 to order. And I would ask Derek if you would play our singing of the national anthem. Director Ferguson, I would ask you to take roll call, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, this is your roll call for January 26, 2022 public session. Trustee Barry. Vice Chair Cram.
Present.
Present.
Yep. Thank you, Trustee Barry. Gotcha. Trustee Danaher.
Present.
Trustee Jacobs.
Present.
Trustee McPherson.
Present.
Chair McAllister.
Present.
Trustee McCray.
I'm present as well.
Trustee McDonald.
Present.
Trustee Parisian.
Present.
Trustee Schooler.
Present.
Trustee Swan.
Present.
Student Trustee Ali.
Present.
Student Trustee Ward.
Present.
Mr. Chair, you have quorum.
Thank you, Director. I have a motion. It's moved by Trustee McCray, seconded by Trustee Jacobs, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve consent agenda items 502 to 503, January 26th, 2022, as submitted. Please cast your ballots online.
Schooler in favor.
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you, Lisa. Are there any conflict of interest declarations? Hearing none. Director Ferguson, would you have any comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, yes, I would just like to take a moment to note the incredible work led by Brad Notman, who is our manager of purchasing, and the team that he assembled to get the rapid antigen tests put into small packages and sent out. As folks may be aware, when those arrive, they come in packages of 5, and we were asked by the ministry to send those out in groups of 2. So what that required was to have people use these fully wrapped packages. They're all individually wrapped inside of the larger package, separate those out, and that meant that there was 60,000 rapid antigen tests that had to be packaged and then sent out to our schools and to our staff. And they were able to accomplish this within the deadline, actually ahead of deadline, but that took a tremendous amount of work, and they're to be commended for that. And so we thank them for everything they did to make sure that we had those out and provide another layer of safety and security and well-being for our staff and also for our students and families. So congratulations to them, and we certainly appreciate their work. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Director. I have a few comments. Today, as you know, marks the 12th anniversary of Bell Let's Talk Day. So my main focus this evening, my comments will pertain to student mental health. I did raise the matter in a discussion earlier yesterday with Dr. Moore and Minister Lecce in our board's teleconference, board chair's teleconference. Dr. Moore, in his presentation to chairs, placed an emphasis on the presentation of in-person learning for the benefit of students' mental, physical, emotional, and psychological health. I did ask him how we, meaning the boards and the province, could accentuate and promote this important measure. He responded by reviewing the new measures in place, i.e., for example, not sending cohorts home, the rapid antigen tests, and all of which was to keep kids in the classroom. For your information, trustees, I did participate and audit the grade 6 remote class from Linklater Public School, taught by the very competent Mrs. Leanne Swan. Both the students and I were very engaged for an hour and 20 minutes, but I recognize that this was not easy for anyone. Mrs. Swan did a fantastic job, and I send my kudos to her. I want to send my appreciation to staff on the synchronous learning in the first 2 weeks of January, as well as their efforts in managing the in-school classes and remote learning as of January 17th. I also want to recognize our staff since January the 6th, who continued the in-school learning for students with profound learning needs in 50 of our schools, involving 103 elementary students and 41 secondary students, who were supported by 69 teachers and 127 educational assistants. This was and is a remarkable achievement for the Upper Canada District School Board. Kudos to all our staff and our senior team for making this happen under extraordinary circumstances. As I mentioned earlier, this is Bell's Help Day. It's more than a day, but a lifelong commitment and challenge for many. I hope that these few short videos that we are going to see briefly will inspire solace, hope, and direction for all of our students. We all have mental health, and this leads us into our next agenda item. So, Derek, I would ask you to play the clip, please.
Whether you put down your phone to be there for your daughter, or pick up your phone to call a helpline for your roommate, when it comes to mental health, now more than ever, every action counts.
Is there a second clip, Derek?
Experienced from a really, really young age. And I think that the more people talk about it, the more that it's not as scary, because It's, you know, people aren't scared when they, you know, break their leg or they have something wrong with their heart and they have to take medication, or something's wrong with their physical health. But when something's wrong with your mental health, it seems to be something that people get really, really confused and scared about, and it's something that they don't want to share, and it's something that so many people have issues with. Every time you go through like a depressive episode or something like that, it's like it feels like it's never going to happen again. You're like, okay, this is never going to happen to me ever again, and then it does, you know, and it changes every single time, and every single time it gets better because you learn more about what you can do to help yourself.
I think that there's an incredible stigma attached to mental health issues, to mental illness, because it's so invisible. So many people have come in, asked me for help with mental health issues, either for themselves personally or for a family member, a friend, a coworker, someone that they care about, because they just don't know what to do. And then I meet so many people. They might tell one person, and that person may have been me that day that they finally told, I'm going through this, I'm really struggling, I don't know what to do. Most people, when they're struggling or confused, they don't know what's going on. And so the judgment is there, I think, because of misunderstanding, lack of education, and plain ignorance. And we need to be better. I'm not going to stop because it matters, because I think there's a shift happening. And we need to keep pushing and keep the momentum going so that every element of our culture, of our society, listens and changes and lets people's voices be heard.
Thanks, Derek, for your work on preparing those clips. As Serena Ryder and Clara Hughes noted, really what they were saying is that every day is a good day to talk about mental health, and we have to keep the momentum going and let the voices be heard. So thank you very much. We are now going to move to item 1001, which is the student wellness and the importance of sleep. And I think I will ask Director Ferguson to introduce our two staff members.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, as you just said in your closing remarks on that last item, every day is a good day to talk about student mental health and wellness. And but today in particular, with this focus that is being shared all around the country, we thought it would make a great deal of sense to invite our chief psychologist and our mental health lead for the board, Dr. David Armstrong, to join us. And joining him is our newly appointed additional chief psychologist, Dr. Jennifer Curry. So Dr. Armstrong is going to be leaving us soon. This will be his last visit here to the board for now. I know there's no actual goodbyes in education. It's always we'll see you later. And Dr. Armstrong will be working in his private practice supporting students and probably a lot of Upper Canada District School Board students, and certainly a lot of work to be done there. Part of the reason that I've asked Dr. Armstrong to come here is because I know that a while ago, one of our planning sessions with trustees, there were some questions around sleep and there were some questions around bus times, and that led to a pretty fulsome discussion with trustees around the start time for our schools and student wellness and the importance of sleep. At that, I committed to having copies of this book, Why We Sleep, available for trustees, and gave those out to several trustees. If you haven't had a copy yet, let me know after this and I'll make sure you get yours. And in that, it talks about the importance of sleep, and school start times is also a big part of it. In a conversation when I was superintendent of student wellness, Dr. Armstrong and I were having a conversation, and Dr. Allison Inglis, around this issue. And I remember at the time, one or both of them said they couldn't think of any other thing that would be more important to improving student wellness than improving their sleep. It was the single biggest issue that was controllable that we could do. And so it's I'm very happy to have both of the doctors here tonight and to share their expertise with us. And I just want to say thank you to Dr. Armstrong for your years of service. It was a pleasure working with you, and we wish you well in your next adventures. And I'd like to also say welcome to Dr. Jennifer Curry. She's not new to us. She's a local person, lives in the district and been working with us for many years, and now has been successful and joining us in now this new role. And we're very pleased to have her. And it always is nice when it's homegrown talent. So welcome and congratulations. And I'll turn things over now to Dr. Armstrong.
Thank you very much. And in learning from Dr. Inglis, within my kind of tenure within the board, I've tried to kind of bring a research perspective to the work we do. And I think over the years, we've come a long way. Sometimes we've gotten distracted by engaging speakers or self-proclaimed experts or external trainings that offer these pseudo-scientific explanations that depart from decades of research. And we've been distracted at times by easy answers by people like Stuart Shanker or Gord Neufeld or Jody Carrington with no research backing whatsoever. But we've rebuilding our internal expertise. We're hiring, and I'm very excited. We've hired back into the behaviorist position, the future growth of that position. Years ago, as the province was distracted by whole language approaches to reading, but we're coming back with the science of reading, focusing on phonics and good response to intervention as championed by our speech language pathologists and our psychologists, as well as the teaching and learning department. And years ago, we were distracted by experts providing anecdotes about discovery math and overemphasizing perhaps reasoning, sometimes at the detriment to a student's ability to do simple math facts quickly. And I hope we've all kind of learned from this pandemic that, we can't, bold leaders can't set policy based on the most passionate or the loudest voice or the most compelling anecdotes. That's when good quality research tells us to do something over and over. We need to take action on it. Next slide, please. So I understand that each member of the board or most members of the board had received a copy of Why We Sleep, Unlocking the Power of Sleep and Dreams, and that's on the next slide. Now on that, you'll see it's an accessible book that mirrors most, academic and technical volumes on the subject. Sleep is fascinating, and really this is a pet project of mine. I'm very interested in it. In fact, I'm very interested to in my new endeavors to be devoting a lot of time to the treatment of insomnia and those sorts of things, sleep disorders. There's a reason we spend a half to a third of our lives in a fairly vulnerable state. We used to think it was simply being unconscious, but we know there's so much more going on with sleep. So this volume reviews the critical role sleep plays in making strong memories or getting the brain ready for new memories. It reviews the timing and the types and as they change from infancy to old age, and I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. And it also talks about sleep phases, these different stages we go through in multiple times during the night, and they're uniquely involved for particular advantages, whether it's fighting disease or reducing anxiety or anger or stress. Now on the next slide, what you're going to see too is we all have different needs for sleep. And that's why the recommendations for sleep, there's quite a range. So, some, let's say, 1 5-year-old might only need about 9 hours of sleep, feel rested, completely fine. Another 5-year-old, 6-year-old might need 11, almost 12 hours of sleep. So there's a real range there. The amount of sleep we need actually decreases as we age. And most people know that, and most 14 to 17-year-olds only need somewhere between 8 and 10 hours of sleep, right? Now, this begs the question, though, why do teenagers always seem tired? If they need less sleep, why are teenagers seemingly chronically falling asleep in class? And this has to do with another really interesting part about sleep, that as teenagers go through puberty, we have this internal circadian clock that basically tells us it's time to go to sleep now, it's time to wake up now. And it makes that process a lot easier. For those of us that have ever worked a night shift before, or if you're choring at 5 in the morning, we know what it's like to have to fight this clock and fight this clock over and over. Yeah, you're working night shift, we can get up, but all of these that have worked a night shift know that you never really get a good quality sleep. Okay, and that seems to be what's maybe happening with teenagers. The circadian clock shifts so that an 11 o'clock falling asleep time is fairly natural for a teenager. The book explains a few reasons why that might be, but I want to talk about what the consequences of that might be. So let's go to the next slide. So the question is, to what degree is this actually a problem? Well, one study, it was a Canadian study studying almost about 30,000 students across 362 Canadian schools. And they found about 1 in 3 teenagers didn't meet the recommended sleep guidelines. Now, the guidelines are there for a reason. We don't think it's just a good idea. It's fairly essential for good development. But the study goes on to kind of ask, well, why is that? Well, in the book there, Dr. Walker talks about, let's say, an 8 o'clock start time, okay, which means buses might start picking people up about 6:30, especially in our rural schools. And probably, as Trustee McPherson could tell us, that means a person has to wake up maybe as early as 5:30 or earlier than that. Now, the question would be, could you concentrate and learn much of anything if you had to wake up at 5:30 day after day after day? Now, that's not a fair question. Okay, remember the circadian rhythm of teenagers tends to shift forward up to about 1 to 3 hours. So instead of us saying as adults, waking up at 5:30, if we wanted to have the same feeling that a teenager would have waking up at about, let's say, 5:30, we've actually got to back that up to about 3:30 in the morning. Okay, so now the question is, could we concentrate or learn anything if we were constantly waking up at about 3:30 in the morning? Would we be in a cheerful mood? Would we feel day after day at easy to get along with our coworkers, or conduct ourselves with grace and tolerance and a pleasant demeanor, waking up day after day at 3:30? And so if we go to the next slide, I'll get back to what the researchers actually found on this. So it's a very large study, and this study is very similar to a bunch that have been conducted over the years. And so they were surveyed, about 30,000 students from 6 to 10. They were surveyed asking about bedtimes, wake-up times, and that sort of thing. School times at that point ranged from 8 to 9:30 across Canada. This is back in 2015. And on the next slide, you've got the results there. So students who attended a school with a 9:30 a.m. start time tended to sleep longer than students with an 8 a.m. start time. This is doing nothing else at all. What happened, the average student slept an additional 30 minutes. They were more likely to meet the minimum sleep recommendations, and they were less likely to feel tired in the school. And research on tens of thousands of other students on varying regions suggests very similar things. So small improvements in academic achievement, increases in sleep duration, and decreases in sleepiness on average. Now, there's a number of more dramatic improvements there. So, for example, there was one in Edina, Minnesota, and they looked at SAT scores before and after they changed from an 8 o'clock to a 9:30 start time. And what they found was actually amongst high-achieving students, it increased SAT scores from between 100 to 150 points. There was also another one, so another school district in Minnesota, and they saw a 60 to 70% reduction in traffic accidents amongst 16 to 18-year-old drivers. Okay, let's put that into perspective. So 60 to 70% reduction in traffic accidents. If you remember when we introduced ABS brakes reduced accidents about 20 to 25%. We're talking about a 60 to 70% reduction just for a cost neutral shift to kind of flip the start times of schools. And there might be some other interesting benefits. It's been suggested too that currently most youth are unsupervised between 2:30 to 5 o'clock. And I can tell you, working in special education and wellness, sometimes that unsupervised period is a period we tend to worry about as clinicians, because there may be being around other people who are poor influences, abusing substances for those students who, who are thinking about suicide or self-harm. That can be a point in the day where we start to worry and plan for that. So later start times also mean later finishing times and less unsupervised times, because typically teenagers are going to be sleeping right up until they actually have to go out of the school. So if we flip the slide there, I also wonder what we're seeing or tend to see is difficulty getting students back. Now, early estimates in the pandemic, this was out of the Toronto District School Board, this stat suggested about a 6-fold increase in extreme absenteeism. And we see something somewhat similar across the board. Certainly, there are groups of kids who were having difficulty getting back into schools. Some of the initial difficulties are that these teenagers have now adjusted their sleep schedule so that they're sleeping in much later in the day, getting up between 10 to 12 o'clock. Okay, so one of the challenges sometimes we have as clinicians then to get these students back is that we're having to wake them up earlier and earlier and earlier, just get over that initial hump. Okay, and so that's one of it. Teenagers, again, if they wake up, let's say at 10, 11 o'clock, they've already missed between 50 to 75% of their school day. And so at that point, some teenagers throw up their hands and say, what's where I'll go tomorrow or I'll try or something. So we're wondering if later school days may enhance at least partial attendance and encourage engagement. But hey, I'm one guy. Albeit I got a PhD in this kind of stuff, but maybe I'm providing you a biased perspective because maybe I'm battling with my teens to push them out the door. And if there's something we've kind of all learned in the pandemic is we all have a personal opinion about these very public sorts of things. And it's very difficult to get ourselves out of that context and out of that personal opinion. So how would you know that you're getting the right answers? Okay, that it's not just me. Well, you might look to groups of professionals looking at all of the research, for example, and maybe they're a little less biased than I am. So if we go to the next page, or next slide, you'll see this is from the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, a position statement saying that, I believe it was 8:30 should be the earliest that we ever consider starting a secondary school. If you go to the next page, that's the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. This is the American Medical Association, exactly the same thing. Another position statement saying that improves adolescent wellness. If we go to the next one, you've got the American Academy of Pediatrics, exactly the same recommendation for later school start times, not starting earlier than 8:30. If you go to the next one, okay, you've got the Society for Behavioral Medicine, and I'm guessing you kind of get the drift after this. Pretty much every professional association studying with position statements. Now, I will say, Canadian associations are a very polite country, and we hate to offend, so they don't often come up with large position statements like this. But their policies, their conventions say very similar sorts of things. So on the next slide, I just wanted to kind of summarize by saying that sleep is crucial for our emotion regulation and learning. Okay, there's a reason that we've evolved to spend a third to half of our lives in a very vulnerable, almost unconscious state. It's because it's adaptive for us. The current school start times tend to run counter with what we know about adolescent sleep changes. Can students get up? Yeah, of course they can. Is it causing all of the crime in our society? Of course it's not. Okay, but despite a lack of randomized clinical trials, research on tens of thousands of students suggests small improvement in academic performance and decrease in sleepiness on average. And so when I say a small improvement, this isn't going to move mountains. It's not going to increase our graduation rate from what it is currently to 95%. Okay, but on average, it's going to move a little, almost everybody's kind of academic performance alertness up. And it may, in fact, make a bigger difference for students with problematic attendance or students with delayed sleep phase disorders or other sleep disorders as well. Because let's say, you know, remember that question, I'm getting you up at 3:30 as an adult to wake up and be cheery and respectful and nice to our coworkers and learn lots of stuff. Okay, well, let's say you've now got a sleep disorder that's decreasing the effectiveness of your REM sleep. Well, that's going to be even worse then. You're not getting that rebound effect in the morning. And as Dr. Ferguson was saying, I do remember Dr. Inglis and I talking about this, thinking that what is the easiest cost-neutral intervention we could do. There's lots of things to increase wellness. There's lots of activities we can do, and I'm excited, honestly, for the direction of the board with some of the plans being put in place on wellness, on numeracy and literacy. But all of those are quite energy intensive. And not that we're afraid of it, but I'm thinking there's probably no other single cost-neutral intervention that could have actually the same impact as just, for example, flipping start times. So if we go on to the next slide, I just wanted to say in one of my final, my final time we get to share together is that I've got great hope for the future of this board. It's the board my own children attend, and they attend proudly there. With the current leadership, I think there's an embracing of evidence-based decision making. So gone are those persuasive speakers sometimes we had, or external training programs designed like pyramid schemes that take advantage, offer meaningless certifications. Through the pandemic, I've seen the trustees for this table take the advice of public health officials presenting good research, even though it might be the unpopular decision, but it was the right decision. And it's not an easy conversation for the future. Like this pandemic, everyone has a strong opinion about these things based on their own personal experience. I will say, though, humanity isn't a stranger to complex problems, and this is not that complex of a problem. So I just want to remind people that we're using the same processes, the same science. We went from the Wright brothers' first powered flight to landing on the moon in 65 years. The phone in your pocket has 10,000 times the power that the Apollo computers did. And that was, again, just about 50 years ago. In about 50 years, we went from discovering DNA to mapping the human genome. And we created a vaccine for a completely brand new disease that was causing thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands deaths worldwide in less than 2 years through rigorous trials. So I think the future of education here is to use similarly good quality research interpreted by research experts, and you've got a great one here in Dr. Curry taking the reins, to move beyond personal opinion and identify the most reliable ways to help students and education staff. So it's difficult work, it's unpopular work. I have very few friends by the end of this, but I think to do a little less is unconscionable. That instead we're taking the research and we're applying it to good education practice. So that's the presentation there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Armstrong. And we're not going to let you go without subjecting you to questions from my colleagues on the board. So I will then open the floor to questions from our trustees.
Trustee Schooler here.
Go ahead, Trustee Schooler.
Well, first of all, Dr. Armstrong, I want to thank you very much for that presentation. Certainly, this is a topic that has been front of mind for myself, mainly because I've been approached by parents and educators who have expressed concern about the effect that lack of sleep has on the ability for students to focus on their studies. In fact, one of the first presentations that I attended was at SFDCI School Council, and the school council chair at that time, Veronica Horsey, had done a lot of work in putting together a presentation that expressed concern about this topic. I guess what I appreciate about your presentation is that a lot of the information that I've been receiving has been anecdotal in nature, but now I have the research at my fingertips to kind of back up the beliefs that I have about the need to address this issue. So I want to thank you for providing me with that and presenting this to the board. And on this day where we're focused on mental wellness, there can be no doubt that this has a direct effect on the mental wellness of our students. And despite the fact that a change in our current status would be somewhat of a monumental task and perhaps not embraced with a great deal of support, it nonetheless speaks to why we're here, and that is to do what is best for students. So wasn't really a question, more of a commentary on what you presented. So thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Schooler. Are there any further questions, comments?
Mr. Chair, John McCrae.
Go ahead, Trustee McCrae.
Thank you, Chair McAllister. It seems for sure that there's a solid foundation of good science behind your assertion, Doctor. Let me ask and put out there several possibilities for you and Ms. Dr. Curry to consider. One is, Trustee Barry and I went to Sharbot Lake a few years ago for something, and I noticed that in that school there were some beds. There was a room with some beds. That's one suggestion that may be worth considering in some of this unutilized space that we'll hear about later. But the point I want to really push, or at least throw out there, is this consolidated timetabling that's around. And one wonders, what if we had asynchronous learning only for the middle 3 periods rather than the full 5? What if that is an impediment to having high school and grade 7 and 8 and high school students perhaps come, if they were taking asynchronous courses, what if those courses didn't begin till 10 and ended at 1? And outside that, for the other 2 hours of the learning day, then they weren't synchronized. I throw that out there and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Trustee McCrae.
Could I ask something?
Yes, by all means, Trustee McPherson.
Thank you. Trying to find a word here. Excuse me for a minute. The early start times for high schools began with a shift in busing policy, actually, which preceded my tenure on the board. And I've been there 22 years, so you can say it was almost a quarter of a century ago. At that time, at least in Lanark County, it was seen as a cost-saving measure. They eliminated dozens of school buses, and they called it staggered busing, which might describe some of the teenagers getting on the bus at 7 o'clock in the morning. And then they eventually came up with this new one called express busing. It's same donkey, just a different color. So I find this presentation enlightening. I can honestly say that if you're going to start picking up students at 7 o'clock in the morning, as I do, you have to be out of bed by 5 o'clock in the morning. But I'm a senior citizen, so that don't count. But the research you're quoting now, and I'm going to start getting technical, did it not exist 25 years ago when this concept was brought in? Because I'll be honest with you, I'm kind of like Trustee Schooler. I've had people question the wisdom, And so you've got some pretty solid facts there. And my question is, did these recent studies, are they a result of this movement to early bell times, or did it exist before and nobody paid much attention to it?
Sure, through your chair, as I was kind of looking at this book, because I honestly didn't know the history of it either. There seemed to be, over the last 40 years, a shift to gradually increasing, or for teenagers to start going to school a lot earlier and a lot earlier. The research that I was kind of pulling up actually happened probably in the last 15 to 20 years. I'm not sure why there was a big push. So, you know, the earlier studies probably about 2010. I'm not sure why there was a push at that point. So it may be, towards your point, Trustee, that some of this, it may have been the busing creating some things that people were noticing, and then researchers saying, well, we need to look at this in a much more systematic way. The nice part about, as we're doing studies, you know, often these studies are smaller and, you know, they may be district by district. After a while, what you've got are a number of studies that can be combined to one mega study. We call a meta-analysis. And so there's been a few meta-analyses out there involving, again, tens and thousands of students. And that's how we know there is some consistency in that research. So for every study we do, you know, there's 2 studies that seem to have an effect, a positive effect of moving ahead bus times, and one that says doesn't have an effect. When we look at all of those studies now with the benefit of time, you know, around, I think it was late 2016, 2017, 2018, we're seeing much more consistency in the research now because we can look at all of the studies in context. So I will say there was probably a lot of anecdotes and a lot of theory about, you know, we know this shift happens for teenagers, but we don't necessarily know the full scale impact of moving these bell times ahead. So I think now we've actually got a fairly good idea without having to do a number of randomized control trials where we basically randomize schools to start times, because that's not very tasteful to many people. So we've had many of these natural experiments that are occurring in the data from those. So towards your point, I think you're right. There's been a resurgence of interest here over the last 20 years in this topic.
Thank you. Trustees, do you have any further questions or comments?
Chair, I do.
Go ahead, Trustee Cram.
I'm just wondering if Trustee Bradford or Trustee Shell would have any comments that they might make. I know that the Student Senate has talked about this topic before, the concerns that students have on the early bell time or in favor of the early bell time or whatever. So I'm wondering if from the student aspect, whether we get some sort of comment from them.
Yes, thank you, Vice Chair Cram. Through you, Chair. I would first say, Dr. Armstrong, this was a very enlightening presentation. Thank you. As a student myself, in our schools, I have noticed, especially this year, that teenagers often neglect the importance of sleep. I myself did. We often pay more attention to our homework and decide to stay up late. And I do feel these extra 30 minutes will benefit students, especially academically, but also emotionally and mentally. I do feel that it is something that the board should consider.
Through you, Chair, to the board. Thank you, Trustee Cram, for the opportunity to speak about this, and thank you, Doctor, for the presentation. My thoughts echo those of Trustee Lee's. I know from personal experience, I'm definitely not the best sleeper, and school is definitely a driving factor in that. I probably can't even count the number of times I've stayed up till 1 in the morning working on functions homework this quadrimester alone. So I definitely do think that the extra 30 minutes would benefit our students, and yeah, it's sort of my personal opinion on that, but it was a very enlightening presentation. Thank you.
Dr. Armstrong, I do have a question myself, if I could ask it. And I think I don't necessarily espouse this, but it certainly is a counter argument to what you were saying, in that there seems to be a conundrum between research and practice, because many of our senior students especially are involved in farm work, after-school jobs, childcare of siblings. How do you reconcile those two?
It's a great question, and through you, Chair, I come from a farming community in southwestern Ontario, so I can certainly appreciate that. And that is, it's a decision that's not without the community context, I'll say. It's a decision that we have to adjust some of our schedules. So I think it is something, it's one of those things that we like to put the idea out there for the community to chew on, show them the results of the research, and we have to gradually shift. So I know lots of parents now who are going, staying home. For example, I'm one of those parents that when the kids were young had to stay home because my teenagers are on the bus already and I've got to put the young ones on the bus, which means I'm staying at work later. Now I'm guessing, you know, if I had to ask my boss at the time, Director Ferguson, you know, could I then instead kind of come to work earlier because I know I don't have to be there to put my teenager on the bus and come home a little, or sorry, go to work earlier, come home a little bit earlier. Those are the shifts that maybe have to be made, and there might be more less need for before school care, but more for after school care. So it's not, those are challenges that certainly I don't think aren't insurmountable by adjusting the community kind of around us. And just because, you know, schools have, there's lots of examples where communities have gone back, both rural and urban communities, to more of a delayed start time, 8:30 or 9.
Thank you. Are there any further questions, comments? Hearing none.
I'd like to list one down.
Go ahead, Trustee Barry.
When the times of the timetable was set up that all the high schools come in at the same time, that was disruptive to some communities and they found it difficult. I just can't see our parents overall accepting that the kindergarten child will be getting on the school bus, some even at 4:07 or 7:15, before the sun comes up in a good part of our year. Being January 26th, the sun isn't getting up until, well, 7 o'clock-ish, and if the kid has to get in the bus before that, it's dangerous. So who would you rather have waiting by the side of the road for a bus? A tired teenager or a 5-year-old? That's what it boils down to. Thank you. I guess that wasn't a question, but how would you possibly approach changing the thinking and introducing this to students, parents, the general public? Anybody got a plan? Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Barry. As always, you put the whole scenario into perspective. Dr. Armstrong, would you like to respond to that at all?
Sure. I think that's a wonderful question, and what makes it wonderful, it's an empirical question. So it's a question that can be answered with surveys, for example, sampling. I would be really curious about what the appetite is out there, which might be another piece of information that we use for this. So certainly the science would say, okay, well, we add 30 minutes of sleep time on average to teenagers. in a parent's mind, is that worth the cost of potentially putting a child who's typically already up, but putting a child on the bus early when it is a little darker? So that is a great question, but it's a question often that I think would benefit from some polling of parents and saying, what is the appetite for this in their communities? At the same time, I will say too, as we've gone through the pandemic, there's been a lot of unpopular moves made that have to be made and certainly probably run contrary to public opinion. But we put them in place because the science was saying, well, yes, this is probably the better thing to do for students. And so there is a time, that's one piece of data we can understand, is to what degree do parents, the average parent, think about this? But the second point we need to consider is this adding, for example, 30 minutes of time to a teenager's sleep, is that worth the shifts for us, and is that empirically beneficial? Are the risks outweighing the benefits in this? And I would say, in my perspective, I think the benefits outweigh the costs.
Thank you very much. Trustees, any further comments?
Yeah, I'd just like to add something. This was done originally in Lanark County strictly to save money. At PDCI that year, there were 11 large buses taken off the road. You multiply that times $85,000 or $90,000 a piece, and you can see what cost savings it generated for, I believe it was still the Lanark Board of Education at that time. Speaking from personal experience, when I drove under the previous modeling, I averaged 3.5 hours a day. Today, I drive almost 7 hours a day under what is, I'll use the term staggered busing. So if it's going to be a huge decision. And it's going to take a lot of study and a lot of thought, but there will be some financial implications as you move forward. There never is. So just a bit of information.
Thank you, Trustee McPherson. Any further questions?
Mr. Chair, I have a comment.
Go ahead, Trustee McDonald.
Not to deal with some of the historical pieces that Trustee McPherson's talked about, but it was only a few years ago that we decided that we were going to do this. At the advice of our director, we wanted to have a common bell time. So a common bell time was put in place, and in order to do that, adjustments were made for our high school kids. So, you know, the initiative that we're talking about 20 years ago perhaps happened. I'm not debating that, but we've also done some things in the last 3 years that have implicated where we are today. And, you know, those decisions were made by the board and at the guidance of our director. So, you know, if we listen to advice and listen to the research, and the research has been around for a long time. I'm not debating that. I think it's important research. Questions were asked at the time. We decided to move forward in this direction a couple of years ago. So, you know, now are we waking up and realizing that there's something that we need to do? That's my question for the board.
Thank you. Good question.
I'd say we're reprioritizing.
Thank you. Anything else? Anybody else? Dr. Armstrong, and you've given us a great deal of fodder for thought, and I'm not quite sure where we will go with this, but we will be going somewhere, trust me. So I want to, as you conclude your employment with the board, I want to wish you a goodbye, and to thank you for your years of service with the board and the expertise that you have lent to us. On the other hand, I'm also issuing a very special welcome to Dr. Curry in her new position, although she's not new to the board. And we look forward to your advice and your help, and we look forward to working with you. So thank you very much. Would you like to say anything, Dr. Curry?
Hi, I'm just excited to be here. Very excited to work with everyone. Yeah, I think this is a really good direction we're going into. It all has to start with a conversation, right? It's just a conversation, getting the information out there, getting ourselves thinking about it. Sometimes we go in a direction and we have to take a look at what it means. And if we need to change it, it's all about adaptation. We expect it of our kids every day, and we've expected a lot of adaptation for them. So it's not about right or wrong. It's about just doing the thing that will help them grow and send them onto a successful future, right? So if that means 30 more minutes of sleep, let's make it happen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Curry. We look forward to working with you.
Thank you.
Trustees, I'm going to move on to, if I can find my screen again, to item 1002, which is the 2021-22 financial forecast. And I will share the floor at this point with the Executive Superintendent of Business Services, Mr. Hobbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just wait for, I believe we're going to pull up the slideshow for the presentation, and I'm just not seeing it on my screen at the moment. There it is. So it's kind of like having my training wheels on my bike to know that the PowerPoint's there. So thank you very much for bearing with me. So my pleasure tonight to bring to you financial forecast number 2 for the 2021-22 fiscal year. Moving on to the next slide. What we'll do this evening is just to give you an overview of the contents, is we'll give you a brief executive summary to spoil the plot of the presentation at the start, give you a little bit of the history that encompasses how we arrived at this particular point in time. As usual, go through the financial forecast detail and of course summarize at the end. So next slide, the executive summary is as follows. So first of all, our financial forecast number 2, which I'm presenting tonight, projects revenues of $398.8 million and expenses of $397.4 million for compliance purposes, resulting in an updated projection for our in-year surplus of $1.4 million. These updated figures also include additional in-year revenues of $6.8 million from Priorities and Partnerships funds, also known as PPFs, some of which are related specifically to COVID support and some of which are not related to COVID support, and some other minor government grants that have been released since financial forecast number 1. So a good part of our presentation this evening is focusing on the substantial changes that we've seen since the last financial forecast. Generally speaking, these additional revenues are offset by corresponding expenses and therefore do not create discretionary funds. So no surprise, oftentimes when we get funding, it's provided to us with an intended purpose, with an intention to spend it for a specific purpose. So as it comes in, we forecast that we are going to spend it accordingly. Excuse me. As you recall from financial forecast number 1, at that time, we projected a $700,000 surplus for this fiscal year. And obviously, based on tonight, it's our current forecast is that in-year surplus has grown to $1.4 million. It's primarily, there's 2 major factors that are at play here. One is a small decline in projected enrollment compared to what we were forecasting at financial forecast number 1, and also an increase in the transportation surplus, which I'll unpack for you shortly. The expense outlook also, I think, keeping in mind that this forecast was actually the bulk of the work that goes into the forecast, which is not a trivial amount of work for the finance team, was really prepared in early December. And most of the work was prepared prior to the time at which Omicron hit. And as you know, the world has changed quite a lot from perhaps what we were expecting at the end of November. what with schools being essentially closed for operationally at least for the first 2 weeks of the school year, and assorted other costs that we've incurred over the time. So the expense outlook has almost certainly changed since the time that we formulated this forecast. But one of the things that we found is it's too early for us to have actually quantified all those changes and built them into the forecast. But I could touch probably on a couple of examples for you later on so you get a flavor for the kind of environment we're working with. So moving on to the next slide then. Just to reorient ourselves, as you know, we're always kind of juggling multiple fiscal years, and so we've had some planning sessions to start the early days of talking about next year's budget. That's the green line for the 22-23 school year. And very recently, in the end of the last calendar year, we talked about the audited financial statements for the previous fiscal year. But really what we're talking about this evening is the blue bar at the top here, which is the current fiscal year. So we're really giving you our best sort of crystal ball look at where we see us ending up financially at the end of fiscal year 21-22, based upon the best information that we have available and our best guess at how things are going to evolve for the rest of the year. So the next slide then, please. A bit of background. So again, as we mentioned earlier, I touched on earlier, we presented the original budget for this fiscal year on June 2nd, 2021, and trustees approved it with an in-year surplus projection of $400,000. On October 27th of 2021, as I mentioned, trustees saw financial forecast number 1. Again, the first year that we've sort of accelerated that first forecast to get better visibility into how we were evolving financially during the start of the school year. That financial forecast identified a surplus of $700,000, largely due to increased enrollment compared to the spring projections. And then, of course, the purpose of this presentation is to provide that second formal forecast. So moving on to the next slide, please. This, what we'll do next is talk about the detail of the financial forecast and give you some more details on how those changes have occurred. So next slide, please. So this slide is familiar to you. Really, we're trying to very highly summarize the board's financial picture, showing you revenue, expenses, and the projected annual surplus or deficit for compliance. So in the first column where it says 21-22 original budget on June 2nd, 2021, what you see is total revenue for compliance at the budget time of $383 million, expenses for compliance of $382.6 million, and a projected surplus at that time of $400,000. Second column over is financial forecast number 1. You can see by that point in October, revenues had grown to $395.1 million projected against expenses of $394.4 million with a surplus of $700,000. And now tonight, what we're seeing is revenue has again grown to $398.8 million projected, expenses of $397.4 million, leaving us with a projected annual surplus for compliance of $1.4 million. So essentially the shorthand is revenue up since the last forecast, $3.7 million, expenses up $3.0 million, again, largely arising from the fact that funding flows to us for a specific purpose. So as our revenue rises, generally our anticipated expenses rise as well, leaving us with an improvement from 700,000 surplus at the last forecast to 1.4 million now, the difference being $700,000. So next slide, please. And here's where we get into the meat of it. So one of the things you may notice right away is, generally speaking, in past forecasts, we were giving you a more summarized version of this slide. And sometimes what happened is in summarizing things, it tends to mask some of the movement that's happening. And we felt in the interest of transparency, it was better to actually put a little bit more detail on the page that we could then unpack for you. So these are really the main contributors to the change in financial forecast number 1 to number 2. So the first thing I think that you'll see here is that from GSN tuition fees, there's been an unfavorable change in revenue down about $3 million. And primarily that's due to an enrollment decrease compared to what we were projecting at financial forecast number 1. So you'll recall In the original budget last year, our enrollment projections were quite conservative, partially due to the direction of the Ministry of Education to budget conservatively. And then once we got into the school year, we had a lot more students materialize at the start of the school year, which caused our revenue and expenses to increase. And since financial forecast number 1, no surprise, that's settled out a little bit. So we're down a net total of students about 70. And that's about 120 students down from financial forecast number 1 in day school, and up by about 50 in over 21 and continuing education. So essentially that represents a $3 million hit in revenue, but the revenue and expense parallel runs the same way to some extent when it's when we have an unfavorable variance, so expenses are also down. And that represents a net unfavorable variance of $500,000 down. With regard to transportation, apropos of the last conversation, that's another big contributor here. And what you see is overall $1.9 million projected surplus at year end on transportation. And just by way of unpacking this a little bit, around March timeframe, the STEO board will approve a balanced budget for transportation. Revenues and expenses are equal for STEO. They then submit that to us, which we build into our own budget. And what happens over the course of the year in operations with STEO, like any other organization, is that the original budget that they present is an estimate of revenue and expense, and more often than not, that comes in, revenues and expenses aren't quite what they projected. So right now, based on the feedback of STEO, we're looking at $600,000 favorable improvement in revenue, and that really is a result of fuel escalation. So we are actually funded to some extent to compensate us for increases in fuel prices. So that would represent about $600,000 in additional revenue. And then a favorable improvement in expenses to the tune of about $1.3 million, which represents a $1.9 million favorable variance. And I'll come back to that a little bit later in another context. COVID-related PPF supports a favorable variance of $6.6 million. And of course, what we're seeing here on the expense side is that revenue is matched by expenses in equal amount. And as I mentioned earlier, virtually all revenue that flows to us comes with a purpose. And so what we assume is when we get revenue, we assume that we're going to spend it for the entire purpose. And so about half of that, a little over half of that, about $3.9 million, is comprised of COVID-related funding supports that the government announced back, I believe, around GSN time, actually. But what they did at the time was they said, we're going to release 50% of the available funding to you. You can build that into your budget, which we did. And then we'll see how things progress with the pandemic. And then we'll choose to release or not release the remaining 50% in the December timeframe for the second half of the school year. Well, they did ultimately choose to release that remaining 50%, totaling about $3.9 million. And therefore, you see that representing the bulk of that $6.6 million. And there are some other additional COVID-related PPF supports like there. So you'll recall last year we received some federal funding to support capital improvements in our schools related to COVID. It's the CVRIS funding, and I can't remember the acronym, so please don't test me, Mr. Chair. But there's some of that revenue in there as well that we carried forward into this fiscal year, as well as some PPE revenue that reflects PPE being received from Ministry of Government and Consumer Services as well. This row represents a good illustration of why the team chose to take a little bit more complex approach to presenting the slide, because if we had used our previous highly summarized slide, you would see a zero net change as a result of this line, and it would mask to some extent the fact that we did really receive $6.6 million in additional revenue, which we felt was important to note. And it was also important to, I think, reflect the ministry and the federal government's ongoing commitment to supporting our ongoing COVID response. So the next line 4, we get into smaller potatoes here. So of course, every year we get some PPF supports for other items. And so again, this is PPFs primarily related to child and youth in care and French as a second language, again, offset by corresponding expenditures. With respect to school budgets, as trustees will know, starting in the 1920 school year and continuing on to the 2021 school year, as a result of the sort of on and off lockdown state of schools, what happened is there were a lot of expenses that weren't incurred just because schools were in either a degraded operational state or they were entirely locked down or closed. And so that led to school budget surpluses being accumulated at the end of the school year. And what we've tried to do over the course of the year is, as it becomes apparent, we can bear the financial sort of cost of doing this, is releasing that budget surplus back to schools. So since financial forecast number 1, this line reflects that we've added another $700,000 to school budgets to assist schools, to use at their discretion to assist in all manners of instructional support, COVID or non-COVID related. And this additional $700,000 represents a total of $1.3 million in additional money we've put into the school budgets this fiscal year since the original budget. So over and atop of the school budgets that they already were allocated in our original budget past June 2nd, we've put another $1.3 million in as well, and you'll see that reflected later on as well. There is some, line 6 reflects, again, a net zero change resulting in UCLC and Champions for Kids budgets, which really represents not much, but activity adding up to zero, but it's really about a realignment of budgets. And then what you see in terms of other revenue and expense changes is, again, a net zero movement overall, but what you're seeing is that deferred capital contributions and amortization changes that are resulting as a result of having less depreciable capital than we forecast originally in the 21-22 budget. We have both less revenue coming in and also less amortization expense as well. So overall, these 7 items represent the big, I think, either impacts to the $700,000 change in year surplus forecasted from financial forecast number 1, and or alternatively, if they are a net zero impact, they're the ones that we felt were noteworthy from a financial standpoint. So moving on to the next slide. What you see here is, again, our compliance status. So again, as we always refer to, it's not just enough for us to present the financials. The Ministry of Education does have a definition for what they consider to be a compliant budget. And the 2 big check boxes that we think of, generally speaking, is that we actually have a more or less a compliance threshold, which is the maximum size of deficit we could theoretically run. And so we are within that compliance threshold because we have a forecasted surplus. And then the second piece of it is the administration and governance envelope, which comprises predominantly the expenses related to the non-instructional aspects of our organization. It's very closely monitored and contained, and our expenses for those types of expenses are within that envelope as well. So we're compliant there. The next slide, please. So this really refers to our accumulated surplus as opposed to the in-year surplus. And as you'll recall, the in-year surplus is how we see the balance of revenue and expenses for the current fiscal year, how we see ourselves ending up for just this fiscal year that we're working with now. But the accumulated surplus or deficit really represents the sum total of all in-year surpluses and deficits up to the end of the last complete fiscal year. And what we're trying to do on this slide is really forecast what we see the accumulated surplus being based on the in-year surplus that we just discussed for the last several slides. There's a couple of things I'd like to focus on. The first one on slide 10 here is the line 3, which is the total accumulated surplus or deficit available for compliance. And what you see happening here is that as of September 1st, 2021, as you'll recall from our financial statements presentation back in the November timeframe, we were sitting at a $17.7 million accumulated surplus available for compliance. And we actually had an opportunity to take a look at where we stand relative to all the other boards in the province in terms of our accumulated surplus. That puts us at 65th out of 72 in terms of the relative size of our accumulated surplus. So if we add on top of that an in-year surplus of $1.4 million, if that comes to fruition, then that would put us at an accumulated surplus available for compliance of $19.1 million at year end, assuming everything else comes to fruition exactly this way. One of the things that I think I just want to draw your attention to is you'll recall earlier that I spoke about the notion of us putting an additional $1.3 million into school budgets since the original budget in June of last year. And as you know, when schools collectively run a surplus, that rolls up to our board's books and it becomes a part of the totally internally appropriated surplus available for compliance. So line 2, any school budget surpluses historically at the end of the year roll up to that. And what you see in the middle column, the in-year increase or decrease, is you see that $1.3 million in the middle column, reflecting that we are actually giving that money back to schools in this fiscal year. So that internally appropriated component available for compliance is being drawn down by $1.3 million, which will leave us with $8.4 million in that internally appropriated part. And that internally appropriated part, of course, consists of any historical unspent school budget surpluses, but it also includes things like surpluses arising from UCLC that have been sort of allocated there for the strategic needs of UCLC, and also Champions for Kids, any funds that are raised for Champions for Kids. And so the real story here, I think, is if all comes to fruition, as we've seen, $1.4 million forecasted in-year surplus added to $17.7 million balance in terms of accumulated surplus available for compliance as of September 2021, which would leave us with $19.1 million in accumulated surplus available for compliance as of August 31st. So the next slide. So the summary, of course, financial forecast number 2 anticipates a $1.4 million in-year surplus, an increase from $700,000 projected in financial forecast number 1. The board has received, I think it's important to note, a further $6.6 million in COVID supports from the Ministry of Education, which has allowed us to essentially release COVID contingency funds that we had set aside from our own regular operating budget. So you'll recall back in June 2nd of 2021, we weren't quite sure whether the ministry was going to come to the table with further COVID supports of a financial nature. In fact, I would dare say we might have all been a little cautiously optimistic that COVID was on its way out the door. So we set aside $2 million of our own operating budget for whatever needs might arise. And fortunately, what we've seen, at least early in the year, we don't see the need for that, especially since the government is coming in to the table with additional $6.6 million for a variety of COVID supports. So that whatever remained of that $2 million is reflected in, has been allocated out to other parts of the organization, or it's reflected in partially our forecasted surplus. I think it's important to note that since financial forecast number 1, we've seen a GSN and tuition fee revenue decrease of $3.1 million, primarily due to a small enrollment decline. So, you know, this is normal. We do see fluctuations from forecast to forecast, starting with original estimates of enrollments, because every projection we do of enrollments is exactly that, a projection. It's our best guess at what's going to happen, and it's natural to see some fluctuations. Perhaps a little bit more amplitude to those fluctuations this year owing to COVID and some of the challenges forecasting around that, but again, normal, and we were able to weather that. We've allocated, as I mentioned, a further $720,000 to school budgets out of the accumulated surplus available for compliance, meaning a total of actually $1.4 million, has been added to school budgets since the original budget passed on June 2nd. And while the COVID response has been ongoing in 2021, we seem to see less severe variance between forecasts. So if you'll recall, last year it was a bit of a roller coaster ride, forecast to forecast. And this year, it's a lot less, lot less severe variances in between forecasts. The one thing I would point out is that since this forecast again was prepared in December, the response to the Omicron variant has undoubtedly had a financial impact. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. Earlier on, I referred to the transportation surplus being 1.9, forecasted transportation surplus for this year being $1.9 million. Well, as of last week, we got new information saying it's in fact only forecasted now to be only $1.3 million. And that's a result of really escalating fuel costs over the intervening time between their own projections. So that $600,000 reduction in the transportation forecast effectively would mean that wipes off $600,000 off of our in-year surplus. So that would take us down to $800,000 instead of $1.4 million. And on top of that, we know we've actually incurred some additional costs that aren't built into the forecast for things like rapid antigen tests for staff. And even as we continue on with the Omicron response, we're talking about additional expenses that we didn't build into the forecast. Staff to pack rapid antigen tests, for example, is one we were talking about today. So I don't, and then countervailing that, you'll see perhaps other effects of schools being closed for effectively 2 weeks and buses not running. So it's really hard yet. And I don't necessarily know that it's going to be a linear path or a steady path financially to the end of the year, but do feel confident that thanks to the modest accumulated surplus that we've got, we do have the opportunity to, I think, address most of the financial uncertainties that are yet to arise. And we expect to be able to provide further insight into these impacts with financial forecast number 3 in the April timeframe. So those uncertainties or known and unknowns that have occurred already or are yet to occur should be reflected in that forecast in April. And that represents the end of my presentation for this evening, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Executive Superintendent Hobbs. Before we open the floor for discussion, can Derek, can you tell me why I'm getting back? All right, I'll try this again. Before we open the floor to questions and comments, I just want to phrase our discussion in that this is not a budget discussion. This is a discussion of the forecast, which is a snapshot of where we are now. So, trustees, I'm opening the floor to questions and comments.
Mr. Chair, I have a question, or sorry, more of a comment.
Go ahead, Trustee McDonald.
I just want to commend Executive Superintendent Hobbs and his team and Director Ferguson. The information that we've received this year has been, more timely. We're able to see the adjustments that are happening a lot sooner. In years past, we would only know, by February where we would be. And at this point, we've already seen, two updates. So I'm very appreciative of the information that's coming forward and how timely it is, and the breadth of the information that's coming forward as well. So thank you to the team for that.
Mr. Chair, John McCrae, may I?
Go ahead, Trustee McCrae.
Thank you. I have 3 questions. Could we move to page 4, Derek? If that were up, I would ask the question where it talks about preliminary budget calculations on the page. I had an idea that it was February and not March. Trustee Hobbs, can you clarify that on page 4? I'm not seeing it, but I know it's in the cloud somewhere.
Well, Trustee McCrae, first through you, Mr. Chair, thank you for the promotion to trustee. Just kidding.
Sorry. No, get that right.
Yeah. So, you know, yes, and I have slide 4 in front of me. So, you know, if people are watching or looking off the attachment, slide 4 is that diagram I have with the 4 bars that kind of show the current year, the past year, and next year. The preliminary budget calculations, we really, it's kind of interesting. Like what happens in the cadence of a normal year is that the ministry will release the grants for student needs, which essentially represents the update of the funding formula at some point in the spring. And generally speaking, I would say in recent years, that tends to be in the May timeframe. And that's really we really can't do much with a great deal of precision until we know how to calculate the funding, because there's so many sort of different formulas and different categories of funding we get. So what we tend to do is, as we get close, we will start trying to, you know, again, look into the crystal ball and do our best to sort of set the table to see what we could get if all things from the previous year were equal. But it's really not, I think, it's really not sufficient, I think, to, you know, I wouldn't suggest basing decisions on it, but it's really more, I think, about giving trustees a sense of kind of what they could be looking at, assuming nothing changes from year to year. And we know oftentimes things do change. So that preliminary budget calculations thing, we try to push that kind of into the March, April timeframe, just because you start to get signals, if you will, from the Ministry of Education about, you know, whether things are going to be mostly the same or there are areas we can expect change, but we really don't get much, we can't really do much quantitatively to present to trustees until we get the GSN. So that's why you don't see it in the February timeframe.
Thank you. Further questions, comments?
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Trustee McRae.
Could I have a supplementary? I have several questions, but the supplementary to this one on page 4. Well, is that preliminary calculations, they're not an outgrowth of the presentation last Wednesday then? Is that my understanding from what you're saying?
Yes, and to Chair McAllister's comments, we're really not the conversation we have with trustees in planning sessions around budget is for the next fiscal year beginning in September. This forecast is for the current fiscal year, which ends at the end of August.
Okay, fair. Next question is for page 10. If we could get to that.
It's coming.
Okay. Thanks, John. I guess I'm, as I have before, just clarifying that available for compliance, internally appropriated, means that we have 8.4 million available. One is for projects, if you will.
What actually, through you, Mr. Chair, if I may. The term internally appropriated essentially means that the board itself at some point in history, and actually before my time, has actually restricted or put its own restrictions around how those funds in that part of the surplus are to be used. So technically it's available for compliance because the board has the discretion to lift those restrictions it's put on for itself. But the reason why the restrictions are there, I would say generally speaking, are because historically the board has said that if schools end the year with budget surpluses, for example, they want to identify that and sort of, if you will, put a sweater around those to express its intent that they should be reserved for school use in future years. Similarly, Champions for Kids, any funds that they have at the end of a fiscal year roll up to that portion of the accumulated surplus available for compliance. And again, you know, because Champions for Kids is a charity, we want to put a sweater around those funds to make sure that the charitable intent that was behind the original donations is honored and those funds aren't used for another purpose. And very similarly for UCLC, when people pay tuition and those kinds of things, that portion of the accumulated surplus that's internally appropriated is by our own discretion or by the board's own discretion sweatered for the purposes of UCLC. Again, we have the latitude to lift those restrictions should the board choose, but it's a really, I think, the intention really of internally appropriating is to underline the intention of a previous board to reserve those funds for the intended purpose. So I would say, in theory, they are. I think that it would be, the board would want to, I think, deliberate on whether they would like to deviate from the originally intended use for those funds.
Yeah, and Mr. Chair, if I may, yeah, that's right. Many of them were sweatered, and it was clear that they were sweatered for a very good reason. But I just want to establish that above and beyond that, from this 8.4 million, those funds are still available if we so choose. And I think you have stated that.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any further questions?
Mr. Chair, I have just a comment.
Go ahead, Justin McDonald.
Just to clarify, we need to be cautious when we think that funds are available for use. The Public Sector Accounting Board practices, rules indicate that we have to go into a deficit situation to use those funds. So we can't move them in to the current year budget. We can't budget for use of them. We have to budget for a deficit. We have to spend more than we receive and then dip into those after we've done it. So it's not a simple process of taking it from a savings account, moving it over your checking account so you can pay your bills. You got to go into overdraft, hold it for the year, and then move it over. So it's not a simple process.
Maybe not.
Thank you for that clarification, gentlemen. Any further questions or comments? Hearing none, we are now going to move. Thank you very much, Executive Superintendent Hobbs, for a very enlightening and positive report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Much appreciated. We are going to go to the report of the student trustees, and at this point, I'm going to turn the floor over to the student trustees.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, Chair, to the board, over the past 2 weeks, Trustee Ali and I's activities have been centered around the formation of a student-led equity and inclusion committee, as well as the finalization of mock-up designs for Student Senate merchandise. Furthermore, we co-chaired our first supplementary Student Senate meeting on Friday, January 14th, 2022. On Friday, January 14th, Trustee Ali and I chaired our first ever UCDSB supplementary Student Senate meeting, which was approximately 1 hour in length and ran from 1 to 2 p.m. These meetings are designed to be shorter, less agenda-adherent meetings in order to facilitate more open discussion from our senators. This provides us with more opportunities to connect with our senators, as well as allowing them to bring ideas and issues to us without conflicting with a stringent agenda. With that said, Trustee Ali and I did have an agenda in place for this meeting, which will be attached to this report on board docs. Agenda topics of discussion included the overview of the supplementary meeting, remote learning, Student Senate, an update to the Student Senate bylaws, Student Senate logo / merchandise update and reveal, and the new Student Senate logo as well as the merchandise mockups are also attached to this report on board docs, as well as final updates from the student trustees. Additionally, per the agenda, we also allowed for a 40-minute open discussion period, which consisted of the following topics and issues brought to us by our senators: mental health impacts as a result of remote learning, declining school spirit, younger students missing the high school experience, school sporting events, quadmesters versus semesters and the advantages and disadvantages of both, election and selection processes for student senators, and finally the 2022 and 2023 student trustee elections, which are set to take place next month on February 26th. And building off of a couple of those topics, in terms of younger students missing the high school experience and quadmesters versus semesters, it was very interesting to hear our student senators make the point that students in grade 11 have not had a single year which we would deem a proper, or I guess, yeah, proper high school experience. They've experienced solely remote learning, and they've experienced high school solely through a lens of a pandemic. And they also stated that they would have preferred to stay with quadmesters due to consistency, because over the past few years, the school year and the methods of learning have been incredibly inconsistent, simply due to the pandemic. And many of our student senators brought forward to us that they felt that sticking with quadmesters for the rest of the year would have been more beneficial to students, as it would have offered an air of consistency to end the grade 12 year before moving into semesters next year, perhaps. So just thought that was worth noting. Finally, Trustee Lee and I passed the following special motion, which I will read out. So the special motion was a request to change the February Student Senate meeting date. This was not a supplementary meeting. This was one of the 4 meetings that was scheduled at the beginning of the year. So the background for this motion is that the rescheduling of the February Student Senate meeting is deemed necessary to allow for planification and organization of the 2022 and 2023 student trustee elections, which take place at the February Student Senate meeting. Due to the circumstances of remote learning and current ongoing state of affairs, it is only right to allow for increased time to complete applications for the 2022-2023 student trustee candidates, as it will prove beneficial for all parties involved. So the motion was to seek approval to reschedule the meeting on February 11th to February 25th, which is when the elections will take place. And this was done in order to allow greater time for preparation for potential candidates for the position of student trustee, as the 2022-2023 student trustee elections take place in the February Student Senate meeting. As in light of remote learning and other recent circumstances, we concluded that an extra 2 meetings of prep time would be beneficial for all parties.
Overall, the meeting was definitely a success, as our senators continued to surprise and impress us. This shorter and less rigid meeting format proved to be an excellent way to invoke open, powerful, and informative discussion from our senators. In particular, it was very important and insightful to hear student perspectives and opinions regarding remote learning, mental health, school spirit, and quadmesters versus semesters. Additionally, this was a great opportunity to receive live feedback on the new merchandise and updated Student Senate logo designs, both of which were met with high praise and excitement from our senators. We will be chairing our next Student Senate meeting on February 25th, 2022. Alongside Principal Dan McCrae, we have also been discussing and working towards the formation of a student trustee-led equity and inclusion committee. This committee's membership would be composed of at least 1 grade 7 to 12 student from every school board-wide. We met with Principal McRae on January 4th and January 10th, as well as with Director Ferguson and members of our senior team to discuss details of this proposed committee. Furthermore, we have drafted an email as well as a survey to be sent to intermediate and secondary principals. The survey in question serves as a means for principals to nominate students for membership of this committee. In order to diversify committee membership, we are asking that principals nominate 1 student from grades 7 to 9 and the other from grades 10 to 12. Taking inspiration from motivational speaker Simon Sinek, we have crafted a mission statement as well as our shared why in order to answer the questions of why we are creating this committee and what it is that we hope to achieve from it. Our why reads as follows: to foster an accepting and safe environment in which every student is represented and diverse voices of students are expressed so that we can be empowered to learn about the diversity among us, transforming the way we think, teach, learn, and act to ensure every classroom in the UCDSB is one where we all belong.
So the mission statement that we've crafted is to ensure that the needs of all students from all backgrounds are adequately voiced, heard, addressed, and met to prepare all students for a successful life.
Needless to say, we are all very excited and hopeful for the creation and debut of this committee, and we will continue to update the Board of Trustees as our progress continues.
Finally, for merchandise and Student Senate logo updates, we have finalized the digital mock-ups and designs for the Student Senate hoodies for our senators, as well as to finalize the updated Student Senate logo. Senators were given 4 logos to vote between, logos A through D, and logo A as designed by Trustee Lee won by a vast majority. Images and files of both the new logo and finalist hoodie designs can be found attached to this report for review. And that does conclude our report. We will gladly take any questions or comments from the Board of Trustees.
Thank you very much, student senators. I will call upon Trustees Parisien and Cram to lead us in any kind of a discussion that they wish.
Thank you very much, Chair McAllister. I was seeing if maybe Trustee Cram wanted to go first, but I will definitely thank our 2 student trustees for this wonderful report. In addition to their initiative of going above and beyond is what I would consider in their roles, truly, coming to the fruition of having extra meetings when they can see that the student voice really wants to be heard and they're there to listen, and then take that information and share it with us.
So I really do want to thank both of our student trustees for going above and beyond in your roles and really wanting to hear the student voice and then bringing it to us so we can hear it. Thank you very much for that, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Parisier.
Just I'd like to follow up from Trustee Parisier and say what kind of a job they're doing this year. They're doing an excellent job. Bringing forth a report every 2 weeks is onerous sometimes, and they're really have come forward and done that marvelous time. So I'm pleased with how they're operating the Student Senate, and things are going quite well. The only thing I worry about is I have to follow the student trustee report, and I'm not quite certain that it'll be as uplifting and informative as what they can do. So I do thank you for that privilege of having to follow you, and I appreciate it a lot. You're doing a fantastic job.
Thank you, Vice Chair Cram.
Thank you.
I just want to add my own comments. I participated, or at least attended the meeting. I think the concept of an alternative or an additional meeting of Student Senate was brilliant. It provided an opportunity for feedback, which was extremely beneficial, especially in the areas of mental health and the perspective of students in their schools. And the fact, you know, they did point out that the high school experience is a very irregular one for many of them. And so it was very informative. So thank you very much. Trustees, do you have any further questions, comments?
Trustee Schooler, through you, Chair.
Trustee Schooler, go ahead.
Just for clarification, what was the general consensus about the quadmester experience?
Thank you for the question. On quadmesters, students found they were fast-paced, yet many students also found them beneficial as they found 2 classes allowed for more time to complete homework in school rather than out of school. And as we discussed earlier, many students found that a quadmester system was beneficial besides the semester system, and many agreed that they would even prefer it to continue on for the rest of the year.
So thanks for that. So one of the concerns that I've heard, and perhaps you can enlighten me, is that the content of some courses in the quadmester is condensed into a shorter period of time. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes, most definitely. Yeah. That was another concern we heard from our senators. We even heard that certain units were cut out in order to fit this time frame, or condensed, as you said. And many senators, especially seniors, found this may be detrimental to their experience, especially for those looking forward to go on a post-secondary education, perhaps at university or college level.
Exactly, and some of the concern that I've heard is that some of the timetabling that has been provided might result in a student having, say, a chemistry class and a math class in the same semester, quadmester, and then next semester have, say, 2 phys ed classes or something like that. So the fact that they had 2 very intense subjects in the same quadmester condensed into a shorter period of time resulted in a very almost impossible workload. And that, as you say, students that were looking for post-secondary acceptance were finding this very onerous. And then other courses that perhaps weren't quite as onerous, this was not a problem. Is that something that was expressed to you guys?
Yes, we did have a few senators who were experiencing the same workload you just mentioned. They did say that they felt it was a bit more stressful, but they also said that their teachers adapted to the situation very well to ensure that their needs were met, and they felt that they were supported the quadmester.
One of the other concerns too that I heard was that in that situation where you had 2 very academic courses, is that there wasn't a lot of communication between the teachers in terms of when assignments were due, or when quizzes were going to be held, so that, for example, a student might have 2 quizzes on a Friday in both of those courses, as opposed to, say, having them on a Monday, which would have given them the weekend in order to prepare for both of those quizzes. And it just seemed like there was a lack of communication between the teachers in terms of when things were due. Has that ever been expressed to you?
I must say that concern was not brought forward by our student senators. However, it is understandable that it was not brought forward in our student senate meeting.
Okay, thank you.
I will say as well that some teachers have actually been, at least this is my personal experience, where my teachers always ask us, for example, my functions teacher, Mr. Storer, if he wants to set a test for Friday, he asks us, what classes do you have? Do any of your other classes have a test on Friday? And if, say, 2/3 of the class put their hands up, he reschedules to Monday or Tuesday. But if it's only maybe 1 or 2 students, then he's like, okay, the test date can stay, kind of thing. And that's been largely my experience throughout high school with the quadrimesters, is generally the teachers wouldn't ask each other, but they'll ask us in the class what our other courses look like, and they'll sort of try to schedule around that. So our teachers are trying to be accommodating in that sense, but no, that specific concern hasn't been brought to us, but I can understand how that would be a concern.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Any further questions, trustees? If not, thank you, student trustees, for your very enlightening and thoughtful presentation. We look forward to hearing your next edition at the next board meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair McAllister.
So at this point, we are now moving to the report of the Special Education Advisory Committee, and I will turn this over to Superintendent Deanna Perry.
Through you, Mr. Chair, SEAC met in its regular meeting on January 4th, 2022. Superintendent McNair presented the proposed 2022-2023 school year calendar and explained the process of public consultation that is going to be occurring and actually is occurring at this moment. And also explained to SEAC that once it is approved by the ministry, the calendar will be released publicly, likely in April. The January SEAC meeting is an organizational meeting with elections held for the positions of chair and vice chair, and Michel Labonté was acclaimed as chair of SEAC, and Deb Wood was acclaimed as vice chair of SEAC. In my superintendent's report, I did recognize Trustee McPherson for his service and leadership as SEAC chair for many years. I also shared with SEAC that we were shifting at that point to remote learning, and that in-person learning would be offered to students with complex special education needs. And I also shared with SEAC that students who were learning remotely at home with special education needs would be continued to be supported with the circles of support that we typically use, both in person and remotely. And so that concludes my report on SEAC.
Chair McAllister, did we lose your connection?
Thank you. I did. I'm sorry about that. So we are now in item 1005, the report of the policy work group update, and I will turn this over to Vice Chair Cram, or Chair of the policy work group, Cram.
Thank you, Chair. The policy work group conducted a virtual meeting on January the 10th of 22. Members of the work group are trustees McDonald, Parisian, as well as myself. And in this particular session, we were supported by Director Ferguson, Chair McAllister, Trustee Danaher, Superintendents Hardy, Hobbs, and McNair, as well as Trustee Liaison Lisa Workman. We reviewed 12 policies at the time, and tonight are bringing forward 5 policies for your approval or direction. So I think the first policy is 226 that would be bringing forward. So if Derek could put up the first slide, policy 226.
Thank you. I have a motion.
I think it's the next slide, Derek. And the next one after that. Thank you. Chair, I'll turn it back to you. I think you've got a couple of movers that you'll put forward a motion right now.
Thank you. The first motion is moved by Trustee Cram, seconded by Trustee Parisien, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve policy 226, safe place, workplace harassment, as reviewed January 26th, 2022. Trustee Cram, you want to speak to this, please?
Thank you, Chair. As you can see on the screen, we are not recommending any changes to this particular policy. We know it has been perused by the superintendency area, the board admin, and Superintendent, can't remember, sorry, came forward with no proposals from Health and Safety Committee. They have reviewed it themselves as well and have agreed that there is no need to change the policy.
Any questions or comments, trustees? Hearing none, I would ask you to cast your ballot, please.
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you. Motion number 2. Trustee Cram, do you want to introduce this?
Thank you, Chair. It would be the next slide, Derek, and it's policy 421, violence in the workplace. And I believe you have a motion, Chair.
Motion is moved by Trustee McDonald, seconded by Trustee Parisien, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve policy 421, violence in the workplace, as reviewed January 26th, 2022. Trustee McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The policy was reviewed as noted. No changes are being recommended at this time.
Thank you. Any comments, questions? Hearing none, I would ask you to cast your ballot, please.
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you, Lisa. Motion number 3, Trustee Cram.
Thank you, Derek. It's policy 424, occupational health and safety. And again, you have a motion, Chair.
It's moved by Trustee Parisien, seconded by Trustee Cram, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve policy 424, occupational health and safety, as reviewed January 26th, 2022. Trustee Parisien.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. The board at the policy committee met regarding this policy, and we have no recommended changes at this time.
Any questions, comments? Hearing none, I would invite you to cast your ballot, please.
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you. Trustee Cram, motion number 4.
Thank you, Derek. Policy 423, partnerships, sponsorships, and cooperative ventures. And I believe, again, you have movers and seconders.
It's moved by Trustee McDonald, seconded by Trustee Cram, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve policy 423, partnerships and sponsorships and or cooperative ventures with revisions as submitted January 26th, 2022. Trustee McDonald.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. You'll see that there are some revisions here. We are on page 2, about the middle of the page, second bullet on the right-hand side on your screen. We're removing that second bullet from the policy. Recommending, sorry, not removing.
Questions, comments? Hearing none, I would ask you to cast your ballot, please.
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you. Go ahead, Trustee Cram.
Thank you, Chair. And the last motion for today, our last policy for today is policy 433, which is on school boundaries. And again, you have a mover and a seconder.
It's moved by Trustee Parizien, seconded by Trustee McDonald, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve policy 433, school boundaries with revisions as submitted January 26th, 2022. Trustee Parizien.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. When the committee met to review this policy, we had a quite lengthy discussion, and our recommendation to the board is to make a change to bullet number 6 or item 6. It just sort of makes the wording and it provides it further clarity to the policy.
Questions, comments? Hearing none, please cast your ballot, trustees.
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you very much, Trustee Cram, McDonald, Parizien, and we thank you for your work on this effort, and we look forward to your next update. Item 1006, update number 7, UCDSB operations and management priorities and practices. I'll turn this over to you, Director Ferguson.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. As has been the case since the pandemic began, we've been bringing as a standing item to the Board of Trustees an update on the operational matters and all things COVID. And we have our usual characters lined up again tonight. We have our Superintendent of School Operations and everything that goes wrong, Marcia McNair. And we have Superintendent of HR, Chad Brownlee, and Superintendent of the Remote Learning and TR Legge's Superintendent Susan Rudders. So we'll start with Marcia. I won't jump in each time. We'll just go from one to the next. So I'll turn things over now to Superintendent Marcia McNair.
Thank you, Director Ferguson, and through you, Chair. Thank you, as always, for having me to share an update, an operational update with the Board of Trustees. The topics tonight that I'm going to speak about will include some public health guidance updates, duty to report information, reporting COVID-19-like symptoms on school web pages, ministry absence reporting tool, PCR self-collection kits, rapid antigen tests, and some criteria referenced when we are determining if we need to shift a class or a school into remote learning. So I'll thank Derek in advance for moving my slides for me. So we'll go forward to the next slide, please, Derek. First of all, I wanted to point out on this particular slide in your slide deck, trustees, the links in blue are active, so you can click on them to read further details on the screening tool, the fact sheet, and the return to school protocol. First off, I wanted to mention that we are still having students and staff screen daily before attending work and school to confirm that they are symptom-free and cleared to attend. Parents would sign the hard copy form to indicate that their child could attend school with us each day. We do not have an end date on that, so that will continue until the ministry or public health tells us otherwise. Second bullet talks about if a student is symptomatic at school and sent home, schools are asked to share this particular document with parents, which outlines the possible next steps. So we do know that our principals have been sharing this fact sheet with families, as well as the third bullet, which is a return to school protocol. So after somebody has gone home ill or stayed home ill, there is information on this document that lets parents know what they do when before returning their child to school, which of course would be back to bullet 1, making sure their child passes the screening tool. And then as new guidance becomes available, both of our public health units have provided us with the direct links, and we've been sharing those out with our schools and families so people can keep up to date as new information is publicized by each of EOHU and Lanark, Leeds, and Grenville. So the next slide, Derek, please, is about what we call duty to report. So there are kind of 3 areas of reporting tonight that I'm going to speak about. So the first is what's called duty to report. And so as per the Education Act and the Health Protection and Promotion Act, school principals have a legal obligation to report communicable diseases in the school, or if they suspect that a student may have a disease. So therefore, we've asked our principals to email their respective health units if there are any cases where a student attending in person displays COVID-19 symptoms while at school. So the student must be in person, and then they would email their health unit. We ask that the emails be sent once per day, providing the number of students that displayed the symptoms at school and include the student's grade and age. No names are provided. The next slide, Derek, is another reporting mechanism we're using at present. So this is where we're looking to report COVID-19 like symptoms on school websites. So as we no longer will be sending families notifications when there's a confirmed case of COVID-19 within our schools, we have created a new COVID-19 info page that is placed on each of our school websites so we can help provide some transparency. So again, at the end of each day, we've asked our schools to update the page with the number of individuals sent home with COVID-19 symptoms and the classroom that they are a part of. So it would be the teacher's name or the class name. This list is not a running list. It is being refreshed daily by our principals. So if there was a day that nobody was sent home displaying any symptoms, then they would just add a nil report with the date to share that. And the next slide, Derek, is the last piece of the reporting. So this is called the Absence Reporting Tool, or the ART. And you may recall I spoke about this tool last year and at the beginning of this year when there was contact tracing happening in schools and we had confirmed cases. Then our principals would use this tool daily by 11 a.m. and they would report any confirmed cases that were presented to us by the ministry. So the tool is being used at this time, but has been revamped. And it is now being used to support ongoing monitoring and public transparency related to COVID-19 impacts on schools. So the ministry is requiring students to monitor their own absenteeism rates and report on student and staff absences, school closures, using this daily reporting tool. And the data is publicly available. When I put the slide deck together, it says will be, but it is publicly available as of Monday, January 24th on ontario.ca, and it uses the data submitted by schools from the previous day. The absences that are presented are percentages of the total combined student and staff absences for that day. And as the ministry has directed us, if absenteeism rises to a defined level, so approximately 30% above a school's baseline, the principals are required to notify their local public health unit. So schools have been asked to identify, looking at September to December, what their baseline would be for student and staff absenteeism. And then they would take that, have that number, and then they would submit the information required into the absence reporting tool daily. And if the percentage come out to be 30% above their baseline, then they would report to local public health. And early this week, our public health partners provided us with information, which was shared with our principals, of how public health would address any schools that reported an above 30% to their baseline. And basically public health nurses would be contacting our school principals, having conversations so they could understand a little bit more closely what has been happening at the school. You know, it could be something due to transportation, weather, certainly could be COVID specific and maybe in a certain area. So they have those conversations, and then public health would determine if there was any other needs that need to be implemented, if there would be a letter that would need to go home to families to talk about any further measures, etc. So again, our public health partners are great to provide that support and will be right there with us if we have any schools that exceed the 30% of their baseline. The next slide, Derek. So the next slide, you also may recall before Christmas holidays, winter break, I would have spoke about PCR self-collection kits. So these were available in schools, and we still have some in our schools right now, but these kits are not being replenished. So the schools are asked to deplete the remaining quantities, and by doing that, they can distribute them to any staff or students who are symptomatic while they're at school. Participation in using the kits is voluntary, and if we do distribute a kit to a student or staff, we will include instructions for use and a letter outlining key information, which includes where in a community the kits can be dropped off and how people can access their test results. And the next slide, please. So just to echo a little bit of Director Ferguson's opening comments, the rapid antigen tests are what Brad Notman and his team have spent a lot of time putting together to share with our schools. So all in-person students and staff will be, if they haven't already, receiving 2 rapid antigen tests for at-home use if an individual develops symptoms. Again, participation is voluntary. To date, all staff and all of our elementary students as of last Friday received the 2 rapid antigen tests. Right now, this week, the tests have arrived centrally for secondary students, and the goal is to have all the tests, 2 tests per secondary student, out to all of our schools by the end of the day this coming Friday and sent home with our students. So I have no doubt that that goal will be met by Brad and his team, but that is what we're working towards right now. And then we will have ensured that everyone in our system that is required to receive a test has done so. If the individual does test positive when using this test, it's depending on their age and vaccination status what their isolation period would be. And again, there's lots of information that is being distributed with the test, including instructions for use and a letter outlining isolation information that goes home. And next slide, please. So the next slide is just a little bit of information. As always, we certainly want to provide maximum learning opportunities for our students by having them in school in person with us. How to remain in school and in person with us. However, we have developed criteria to assist us if we need to shift a class or a school to remote learning. So on, you will see a few bullet points here that some of the criteria that we have is we've identified an internal coverage plan called the UCDSB contingency plan for staff absences, and we've been working on that with our principals. And so this provides a lot of flexibility, but at the end of the day, if we have exhausted everything in that plan and that we have several staff absences that are unfilled from a following day, then by 8 o'clock in an evening, we may have to make a decision to shift a class or a school to remote learning. And we want to try to do that the evening before the best we can to give parents time to come up with an alternate plan. Again, this is when we've exhausted and used everything in our toolkit and in our plan, because our goal would be not to make this shift. If we have to make the shift, the length of the transition to online will be based on school factors and not a fixed period of time. So we would have a goal of not shifting people back and forth on a day-to-day basis, but we would work very closely with the school to understand the school factors and what would be a reasonable time frame that we could shift back to in-person learning. And school principals would be consulting with their family of school superintendent as they anticipate a need for this shift for remote learning. So it doesn't happen in isolation. There is lots of consultation and conversation before we would move in that direction. And the next slide, Derek. The next slide just talks a little bit about special education. So as you know, I'm just sharing on behalf of my colleague Superintendent Perry, during times of provincially mandated remote learning, school boards were expected to make provisions for in-person support for students with complex special education needs that couldn't be accommodated in remote learning. So as such, if we had to shift, as outlined in my previous slide, to remote learning due to staff shortages, and we would still want people to know that students with complex spec ed needs may continue to be supported in person during this period. And we would be using the same criteria that the ministry mandated when they shifted us all to remote learning. So the 3 criteria points are listed there. Students cannot be accommodated in any other form. They have an IPRC placement in a full-time spec ed classroom, and they have a schedule that is 100% alternative in nature. But it is important to note that if a student typically comes to school in the regular transportation and the shift to remote learning may occur for a short period of time, STAO may not be able to put that special transportation in place, and parents may need to drive their children. Students already taking special transportation may not see a change in their transportation. So if we have to make that shift, we'll be working very closely with STAO. We can't guarantee that that transportation will stay in place, but we will certainly be working closely to do the very best we can. So I think this concludes my portion of the operational report this evening, Chair. And I'm not sure if you want to just move on to Superintendent Brownlee and take questions at the end. If there are any through you, Chair, I'm happy to do as you wish.
I would suggest that we block it. And are there any questions of Superintendent McNair?
Through you, Chair, Trustee Schooler.
Go ahead, Trustee Schooler.
Well, first of all, I want to thank and commend Director Ferguson and Superintendent McNair, who attended the Parental Involvement Committee meeting last night. There was a lot of concern that was expressed about the change in reporting that has occurred, and both of these individuals were able to provide very detailed explanations to concerned parents about this. So we can expect then on school websites that there will be an update as far as COVID cases in the school without giving names, and that should be available on any school's website at this time.
Through you, Chair, yes. And if I can just say, Trustee Schooler, it's not necessarily COVID cases, it's students who displayed COVID-like symptoms while they were at school and would have had to go home, because we can't confirm if it was COVID.
Okay, so there's been concern expressed to me about the fact that the schools are not really reporting adequately, but I don't think that maybe what folks understand is that this is not our decision. This is something that has been passed on to the boards by the Minister of Education and by the top doctor in the province, correct?
Correct. Through you, Chair, correct.
Right. So, I mean, if we are receiving concern about that, it's kind of out of our hands. We're trying to be as transparent as we can, but we've been told basically that it's not our responsibility to take on that medical role. I'm wondering, it seems to me that the health people have shifted some of the responsibility or downloaded some of the responsibility onto the schools. There's no longer any contact tracing. And so it seems like we've been burdened, well, I guess burdened, because we seem to be getting a lot of extra work in schools that previously had been done by the health units. Comment or no comment? That's just my opinion.
Through you, Chair. Yes, correct, Trustee Schooler. There's no contact tracing happening at the schools. So then in order to show a bit of transparency and be responsive to our families, what we felt was what we could offer is by setting up these web pages, and then if we sent somebody home, so they displayed COVID-like symptoms at school, then we sent them home, then we could report that a student, sorry, let me correct that, an individual has left a classroom environment because they were displaying COVID-like symptoms. So again, that is above and beyond what the province has asked us to do, and so we are just looking to show some transparency, and of course we are equally concerned to keep our schools open for in-person learning and be supportive to our families and make sure people know, you know, we're doing everything we can to make sure the school is healthy and safe.
Right, and I think it's important for us as trustees to realize if we're getting concerns expressed to us from parents that we're doing, as you said, more than we have to do, and that the decision to take this new tact is not one that we made on our own, but one that was forced upon us by those above us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Further comments or questions?
Mr. Chair, John McCrae.
Go ahead, Trustee McCrae.
I'd like to second what Trustee Schooler has said. It seems to me that we follow what the community does. We're not leaders in infections. And in fact, that's a function probably of how good a job we have done as a sector in regard to that. And that gives me some comfort. Thank you.
Thank you.
Further comments or questions? If not, we will proceed to the next phase, and I think it's Superintendent Brownlee, right?
Yes. Thank you, Chair McAllister, and thank you, Superintendent McNair. Good evening, everyone. Through you, Chair, now that we've returned to in-person learning and we continue to deal with the impact the Omicron variant is having on our communities, I wanted to bring an update this evening to you on how we're supporting our schools with staff shortages that they may be experiencing as a result of that. Based on the data that we have in our attendance reporting and replacement system, UCARIS, we can confirm that the Upper Canada District School Board is having an above average success rate in replacing absent employees when compared to other boards that in the province who are tracking their data in a similar manner that we are. Since returning to in-person learning on January 17th, we've been able to fill 65% of our absences with staff from our occasional list, and an additional 15% of those positions using emergency off-list personnel for a total of 80% of our positions being filled. This is slightly lower, as we expected, than the 72% and 88% we were achieving up to the Christmas holidays on December 17th. And I just wanted to share that while our primary objective obviously is to fill all our positions with staff on our occasional lists, as you can imagine, given the employee shortage across all sectors of work, we've had to access emergency off-list staff more frequently in an attempt to prevent class and school closures due to those shortages. Along with using emergency off-list staff, our principals are also employing a variety of internal strategies to staff their classes and cover supervision, as Superintendent McNair mentioned previously in her report. And the Human Resources team has implemented and are following the following strategies to support our schools. We continue to update and add to our current occasional staff complement through ongoing active recruitment of elementary teachers, educational assistants, early childhood educators, and secondary teachers. And we were very pleased to see that on January 10th, the Ministry of Education announced that retired teachers, principals, and vice principals would be permitted to work 95 days, which is an increase from their previous cap of 50 days. And as well, we could access second-year Teachers College candidates to be hired into paid positions. Our job postings for the occasional teaching list were updated to allow for teacher candidates to apply now and then indicate graduation dates that we will assist with us with outreach. We've also continued to our active recruitment of staff at university graduate fairs and career fairs, where we're making those personal connections with future employees for all our working groups. And finally, we've implemented a central system staff deployment process, which is part of those internal processes that Superintendent McNair talked about, designed to support those gaps that may exist in our schools. These combined efforts of our school teams, our system staff, and the HR department have allowed us to continue to offer in-person learning in all our Upper Canada District schools to this point. Thank you, and I'd be happy to take any questions at this point.
Thank you, Superintendent Brownlee. Trustees, do you have any questions or comments? Hearing none, we'll be moving on. Is there an additional report?
Yeah, Superintendent Rudders will be next.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair McAllister and trustees. Through you, Chair, it's my pleasure just to share a brief update on 2 items at this time. And the first, of course, is on remote learning since our return to in-person learning a short time ago. And so you're already aware, of course, that we had a 2-week period of remote learning immediately following the winter break, and then 2 subsequent inclement weather days. And finally, by Wednesday, January 19th, our students returned to in-person learning. And our remote learning model has remained consistent from last year and throughout this year, in that our students who are selecting remote learning remain attached to their mainstream school and their regular classroom teachers, and they may return to in-person learning really at any time. We continue to provide 3 remote learning options that are attached to our mainstream school classrooms, including the synchronous digital, which is where there's a live connection with the teacher and in-person peers each day. Asynchronous digital, which is online assignments that the students are completing on their own schedule, and asynchronous non-digital, where absolutely necessary, pen and paper assignments are being provided by the teacher. And so students who have requested to remain in a remote learning program as of January 19th have been able to do so with very little or no delay. Next slide, please. So the slide that we're going to look at next really outlines the breakdown of all of the learning models as of January 19th. And so you can see that elementary, we had, as of January 19th, 7.5% of our students, elementary students, in a remote learning program, and that compares to 2.4% prior to the winter break. And in secondary, we had 8.5% of students in a remote learning model as of January 19th, and that's compared to 2.7% prior to winter break. So overall, K to 12, this represents about a 6% increase since prior to the winter break in students who are choosing remote learning. And of course, we're going to continue to monitor the movement of students both in and out of remote and in-person learning in the weeks ahead. But I do think it's important for us to note, though, that by comparison, the numbers of remote learners we're seeing now is really still quite modest as compared to what we experienced last year. So in 2020-21, over that course of that school year, the percentage of our remote learners fluctuated between 17 and 20% of all students in our board. So really, even at a 6% increase since before Christmas, we're still significantly lower than we were all of last year in that 17 to 20% range. And I think that, there's many factors that may be influencing that significant decrease from last year. Certainly the availability of vaccines as a protective factor for students and staff is one. The public health measures that have been implemented, I think, to a very high standard by our staff and our schools brings confidence. And as well, I really do believe that our parents and our students are recognizing, just as we have, that in-person learning is the best option for children in terms of both their learning and their social and emotional well-being. So we really understand that parents are all in individual circumstances, and those individual circumstances influence their choices about how their children are going to remain connected to learning right now. But we just really look forward to the day when we can receive all of our students back as in-person learners, and we hope that that'll be as soon as possible. So the second item I'd like to just update the board on tonight, if we could move to the next slide, please, Derek, is the return to the semester model and the district-wide timetable in our secondary schools. And so late last week, our public health partners at the Eastern Ontario Health Unit and the Leeds Grenville Lanark Health Unit confirmed their support for us to return to the semester system effective February 2nd. And so, of course, just to refresh everybody's kind of understanding, is that our students in a semester system take up to 4 courses that run from February 2nd to June 27th. The return to the semester system really allows us to proceed with the system-wide implementation of district-wide timetable, which, as you know, was delayed from occurring in September of 2020 when we were required to adopt a quadmester system as a part of our response to the pandemic. And so the district-wide timetable provides a consistent start time, end time, and bell schedule in all of our secondary schools, and will support our continuing and ongoing efforts to coordinate program delivery across our board so that we can ensure greater equity of access for students to program options, regardless of the geographic size, location, or the size of their school. For more information and to refresh your memories around the district-wide timetable model, I would draw the attention of trustees to the implementation guide, which is attached within as an item within this item on tonight's agenda. And that concludes my update. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy on either of these topics. I'd be happy to respond.
Thank you. Superintendent Butters, are there any questions?
Mr. Chair, John McCrae again.
Go ahead, Trustee McCrae.
Thank you. Is it that that this district-wide tabling now, is it significant that it has to be coordinated with the asynchronous classes that would happen simultaneously? Is there room for, say, 3 of 5 periods in the middle of the day to accommodate? And this comes back sort of to the sleep issue, but I'm just wondering, I guess my question is it an impediment to that? Superintendent Rudders.
Through you, Chair, I don't see it as an impediment. In the asynchronous remote learning that may be taking place for some students, the students are really choosing when they wish to engage in the assignments and the work that's been placed in the online platform by their teachers. So from an asynchronous perspective, it's not necessary for students to be aligned with any timetable if they're studying from home. For the synchronous students, they will simply have a clear understanding of the schedule of when the particular course they're taking synchronously from home is scheduled in the day. So they'll follow the same timetable at home that they would have followed if they were engaged as an in-person learner at school. So I don't believe it'll cause any impediment to any of our remote learners continuing to access learning from home for the period of time that they're choosing to continue not to come back in person.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Further questions?
I have one, Chair.
Go ahead, Trustee Cramp.
Thank you. I don't know if Superintendent Rudders can answer it or not. It may have to go to Director Ferguson, but you can give it a shot. And it's not directly related to the report, so I'm looking for the chair to either to have some leeway with me. It has to do with return to school, though. I had a area-wide school council meeting on Monday, and one of the major concerns, and we know that pedagogically and mental health-wise, one of the major concerns of high schools was extracurricular activities. With Premier Ford announcing that as of January 31st, no non-spectator sports or non-spectator activities can be reinstated in areas, and saying we're going to semester. Has anybody looked at, or do we have any foresight as to when extracurricular activities may start to come back?
I'm going to defer that question through you, Chair, either back to Director Ferguson or to one of my colleagues. I know that Superintendent Loshaw is kind of looking after sports for us, and I also know that Superintendent McNair is our main contact with the health units who would provide us with direction on that. So perhaps I'll go to Superintendent Loshaw first.
Thank you, Superintendent Rudders, and through you, Mr. Chair. We have reached out to our public health partners, and at this point in time, We're waiting for them to provide us with updated information. So for now, pause remains on sports and on other extracurricular activities, and we will update the system once we receive that updated information.
Trustee Cram?
It's okay, Chair. That's basically what I was expecting, because I know that it takes time to do it. What I'm just hoping is that we can, pressure isn't the right word, but I'm hoping we can put some influence to allow at least for the mental health of our students some extracurricular activities.
Superintendent Loshaw, may I ask, is it possible for you to request an update as opposed to wait for an update?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we requested an update, and we have requested an update from both public health units. And as I understand it, our chief medical officers of health are reaching out to the province to get further clarification and direction. So we do meet on a regular basis with our public health partners and with our coterminous board, and we're just waiting for them to get updated information to share with us.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Hearing none, I want to thank the members of the senior team for your report. It's very informative and up to date, and again, thank you. So we are going to move at this point to 10:07, which is a response to the motion report on the Oxford on Rideau Public School. I'll turn this over to Director Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, it's my pleasure to introduce Family of Schools Superintendent for the area and for the Kemptville Family of Schools, and that's Superintendent Deanna Perry, and she has responsibilities for the schools in the area that are impacted by this report tonight, and so I'll turn things over to her at this point to give the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, I'll just wait for Derek to put the slide deck up. Thank you, Derek. And if we can go to slide 2. So through you, Mr. Chair, as trustees will recall, a motion was passed at the December 15th, 2021 board meeting directing staff to prepare a report on enrollments, facility, and other conditions related to Oxford on Rideau Public School and nearby schools, with the intent of determining whether, since 2017, there have been any changes that would materially impact the decision to close Oxford on Rideau Public School. Derek, if you could move to the next slide, please. By way of background material, on March 23rd, 2017, UCDSB trustees approved the closure of Oxford on Rideau and directed that the school be consolidated with South Branch Elementary School. This was subject to space being made available at South Branch and accounting for the implementation of French immersion programming, as the school at the time only offered core French programming. At present, dual track programming, referring to both the core and immersion French programming, is being phased in at South Branch Elementary School and at Kemptville Public School. Both schools now offer core and immersion programming from JK to grade 3. Grade 4 will be added in the 2022-2023 school year at both schools. Kemptville Public School has begun offering core French programming to students in grades 4 to 6 in this current year, referring to students who are within the Kemptville Public School boundary who would normally be moving to South Branch for core programming. There is core programming now available for those students at Kemptville Public School. And it is expected that the dual track programming will be fully implemented at both of the schools by the 2024-2025 school year. Next slide, please. This slide speaks to some general information around enrollment projections. And so the enrollment projections that were used in the Building for the Future report were based on the actual enrollments of the 2014-2015 school year. These projections took into account assumptions about planned program and boundary changes, and also population trends that were available at the time. So in general, enrollment is impacted by the number of school-age children within a specific area, the number of births within an area, the rate of migration into or out of an area, and also the choice of program that parents will make for their children. That could be the choice of board or choice of programming option. Housing developments are also an important factor that can indicate migration into an area. Housing developments on their own, however, are not necessarily an indicator of enrollment increases, as not all new households that are built within an area and occupied within an area will have school-aged children within the household. Next slide, please. So this slide provides a comparison between actual enrollments in 2017-2018 and also 2019 and 2020, and the projected enrollments that were included in the Building for the Future report. As you can see, North Grenville had 32 students over projections in 17-18 and 67 over projection in 19-20. Kemptville Public School had 19 students over projections in 17-18 and 59 students over projections in 19-20. Merrickville Public School, which is within the North Grenville family of schools, had 15 students over projection in 17-18 and 8 students below projection in 19-20. Oxford on the Rideau had 14 students under projection in 17-18, and that remained the same in 19-20. And South Branch had 8 students under projection in 17-18 and 5 more than projected in 19-20, which is considered essentially in line with projections. Of note, even prior to the decision to close Oxford on Rideau, 30 students from within the Oxford catchment area selected to attend South Branch, and that has not changed. In the 2021-2022 school year as well, it's important to note that there were 5 junior kindergarten registrations at Oxford on Rideau. Next slide, please. This chart shows the current capacity and utilization of the schools within the North Grenville family of schools. North Grenville District High School currently sits at a utilization of 96%. There are 6 portables on site, but the portables are not currently needed, as the new addition at North Grenville is able to accommodate the students at the school. Kemptville Public School is currently at a 128% utilization, and 4 portables are currently required to accommodate students at the school. Merrickville Public School and South Branch Elementary School are at 79% and 82% utilization respectively, and there still is space available in schools to accommodate additional students should the need arise. Oxford on the Rideau is currently at a 29% utilization, which is under the 34% that was projected for the 2021-2022 school year. Next slide, please. This chart shows the projected utilization rate of schools within the North Grenville family of schools for next year, the 2022-2023 school year. North Grenville is projected or predicted to be at 98% utilization, and Kemptville Public School is projected to be at 119% utilization. Kemptville Public School is expected to require approximately 5 portables to accommodate students in the 2022-2023 school year. It's not expected that North Grenville will require portables. Now, the information here assumes the closure of Oxford on Rideau and that there's a consolidation with South Branch, which is why we see in this chart the increase to 94% utilization at South Branch. Can we move to the next slide, please? And this slide shows us a projection out to the 25-26 school year. By this time, dual track programming will have reached full implementation at South Branch and Kemptville Public. As with the previous slide, the information presented here assumes the closure of Oxford-on-Rideau and consolidation with South Branch. So by 25-26, North Granville is expected to be at 100% utilization, and it's not currently anticipated that portables would be required. Kemptville Public is projected to continue to need at least 4 portables, as the projected utilization is 115%. South Branch is not projected to change considerably in the percentage of utilization from the projections shown in the previous slide, and it's the utilization is predicted to be 93%. Of note, in the Building for the Future report in 2017, it was projected that with the consolidation of Oxford-on-Rideau and South Branch, that the utilization rate would be 97% by 24-25, which is in line with what is being shown here in this slide. Next slide, please. As part of the preparation of the report, there was a review of the overall facility conditions at Oxford-on-Rideau, and essentially what we see is that the school is in generally good condition, and at present there are no immediate concerns for staff and student safety. The majority of the work that would be required at the school is related to the normal life cycle of the elements of the facility. Next slide, please. In terms of housing developments, we took a look at the average of new units being built within the Kemptville area over the past 5 years. And what we see is, on average, there are approximately 139 new units that have been built over the past 5 years. There is fluctuation year to year. An increase in the number of school-age children is expected, particularly within the Kemptville proper area, which could impact enrollment in schools within the North Granville family of schools, as children move with their families into newly built units or occupy existing inventory. The projections that we have been using have accounted for this potential migration into the area. Next slide, please. So some other considerations that trustees might want to take into account. One that I previously mentioned earlier in the presentation is that on average, we have approximately 30 students within the Oxford-on-Rideau catchment area who have selected to attend South Branch Elementary School for core French programming, and that has historically remained true even prior to the decision to close Oxford-on-Rideau. As of the 2022-2023 school year, French immersion programming will be available at both South Branch and Kemptville Public School. Core programming available at Kemptville Public School for students in JK to grade 4, so they'll be dual track from JK to grade 4. Students in the Oxford catchment area who select immersion programming in grades JK to 4 will attend South Branch Elementary School. Students in the Oxford catchment area who selected immersion programming and are in grade 5 and 6 will continue to attend Kemptville Public School as the phase-in of dual-track programming continues. There has been an increase in the number of school-age children in the family of schools, which could impact enrollment depending on parental choice of board and program. So this concludes the presentation to trustees this evening, and I would open it up to any questions.
Thank you, Superintendent Perry. Trustees, I'm opening the floor up to questions.
In light of no questions, I have put forward a motion in regards to this report.
Thank you, Trustee Swan. I will read the motion.
Thank you.
There are actually 2 motions. So the first one reads as follows. Whereas there are 3 elementary schools under the Upper Canada District School Board in the Kemptville area, namely Kemptville Public School, South Branch Elementary School, and Oxford-on-Rideau Public School. And whereas on March 23rd, 2017, the Board of Trustees for the Upper Canada District School Board approved a motion to close and/or consolidate a number of elementary schools which included a resolution to close Oxford-on-Rideau Public School effective September 2018, subject to making space available at South Branch Elementary School. And whereas the grade 7 and 8 students formerly at South Branch have now been relocated to North Grenville District High School, so that there is space available at South Branch as contemplated in the board's March 2017 resolution. And whereas the Ministry of Education recommends a school should only be subject to accommodation review once in a 5-year period, unless there are circumstances determined by the school board, such as a significant change in enrollment. And whereas the Board of Trustees has received a staff report confirming that the population growth in the Kentville area has increased at a more rapid pace than was projected in 2017. Therefore, be it resolved that the Board of Trustees approve a stay in the implementation of a closure of Oxford-on-Rideau Public School for 1 year to September 2023, pending further consideration of the staff report presented on January 26, 2022, and public consultation on the contents of the report. So I'll stop there. So that motion is moved by Trustee Swan, and I believe she is looking for a seconder.
I'm happy to second it, John McCrae.
Trustee McCrae, you were a seconder. I'm opening the floor to discussion, and I'll begin with you, Trustee Swan. Trustee Swan is having some technical difficulties. I'm going to move then to Trustee McCrae. Trustee McCrae, would you care to speak to this motion?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, it's with this mute button. I think I'm live, or
yes, you are. Go ahead.
Okay. I believe the repeating of a utilization rate might better be called utilizing space, and it could be a variety of uses. So that doesn't move me too much. It strikes me that this dual track issues, when they go from one school to the next, are identified in other areas of this board as being manipulative. I think that this is probably a good school to stay open, and I would like us to check the rates of kindergarten registrations this fall. 2019-2020 is quite a bit different from 21-22. There has been an influx of people generally into rural areas. I think the closest measure we could probably get on what's on the ground today is what are the registration rates in kindergarten. I don't like to close this school, any school. So it's up to Lisa, I guess, to say. She moved it.
I have got my computer back. May I speak?
Yes, you may. Go ahead, Lisa.
Okay. I think this is a great opportunity for us to get a further report with further information from staff. And especially, like Trustee McCrae said, in regards to COVID, I don't think the numbers are totally true, because many of the young students have been staying home or may not even be enrolled in school and just homeschooling at this point in time. So by giving the board staff time to come back with further information and do and have a public consultation, I think fulfills our duties and gives us a chance to make sure that we're making the correct decision at this point in time based on the changes to the enrollments.
Okay, thank you. Trustees, does anyone else wish to comment on this?
I have a question, Chair.
Go ahead, Trustee McDonald.
Would a school boundary change?
Sorry,
Sorry,
Trustee Cram. I thought it was Trustee McDonald. Go ahead, Trustee Cram.
Okay. Would a school boundary change in the area help in that particular instance? And if Kemple is overcrowded, and if South Branch became taking some of the areas from Kemple Public, then possibly put kids back to Oxford. I'm just looking at the feasibility of a report coming back with that is either a possibility or it wouldn't make any difference. Would make better sense to stay it until we get that report back.
Superintendent Perry?
So that is information that we would have to take a look at to be able to provide information to trustees. In terms of where we're seeing the majority of enrollment growth, it is in the Kemptville proper area, and a lot of the new housing developments that might bring students into our schools based on program choice and based on parental choice of board are looking like they're in the Kemptville Public School catchment area. So that's where we're seeing the growth at this point, and that's where we're seeing the growth in terms of the enrollment at Kemptville Public School, and then of course at North Grenville.
And so perhaps this could be included in the report, a look at that and possibly grandfathering people as well that are already attending their schools of choice.
Thank you. Further questions?
I have one.
Go ahead, Trustee McPherson.
On a, I guess, a related note, is there a statute, a limitation, so to speak? We're closing on the 5th anniversary of this decision, and nothing has been done. Every year we put it off. From a layman's point of view, and I think it was disclosed to us 3 or 4 years ago, there is distinctly going to be a need in the Kemptville family schools, whether we like it or not, for a 3rd elementary school. Given the age of Oxford and Rideau, I would say perhaps we should hit the pause button simply to consider if in 2 years' time that maybe we need to entertain the construction of a new school south of Kemptville. I don't know why I'm getting Temple up here, but and it just bothers me a wee bit that if I have a school that was chosen not to be closed, at the end of 5 years, we can start the procedure to close it. And conversely, if we have chosen to close the school and we haven't acted upon it in 5 years, I think we have to repeat the process. I don't know whether that bears anything to this case or not, but that's just my opinions.
Thank you.
I think Director Ferguson wanted to chime in, Chair.
Go ahead, Director.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. Just an answer to the trustee's question, and certainly other folks had the same question, Trustee McPherson. We're kind of in uncharted territories with some of this. Usually when schools, when these motions get passed, schools are closed in fairly short order. But as we all know, these ones had some certain stipulations attached to them because they were dependent on other things occurring. And some of that in this case, this particular school, was that there had to be room at the school. And thanks to the good work of Superintendent Hobbs and his team. That room was made available by the addition that was put onto the high school, North Grenville High School, and moving the students over there. So people had the same question that you had, Trustee McPherson, and so we have contacted our legal counsel about that, and they've told us that no, it does not run out. You can't just play the clock out on it. It's a motion that the board passed, and in order to change that, you have to go through this very involved process that we find ourselves in now, including these most recent steps. And so it's not just as simple as, you know, the 5 years has passed and so now the school gets to stay open. There is an existing motion of the board that was passed stating that the school is to close. So the steps that have been put forward here today are the ones that trustees would need to embark upon if they felt that more time is needed to assess this and determine whether or not sometime in the future that motion should be changed and the school to remain open. But it doesn't run out. So there's your answer to that. Lots of people had the same question. Thanks for asking that, so we can get that out on the table. But it doesn't. It stays until there's action taken to overturn it.
And may I just add something as well to Trustee McPherson's comment? The facility condition at Oxford on Rideau is fairly good condition, so it's not like it would need a new build right away or anything as such.
Trustees, any further questions or comments?
Please, yes.
Go ahead, Trustee Barry.
In the present situation, I heard that the kindergarten enrollment was 5. How were these 5 children being accommodated? What's the grade arrangement, or how is the class of 5 being accommodated, please?
Superintendent Perry?
Through you, Mr. Chair, with a smaller school, there are multiple grades within one classroom. And so there is a combined grade for the kindergarten students at Oxford on Rideau.
At this rate, 5 new students, K to junior K to 7, that's only about 40 students. So this year anyway, it doesn't look as if the school is going to get very many more students. We'll be in the same spot next year. Thank you.
Any further questions or comments?
Oh, I just want to say that's why we're asking for the staffing report, so we can get a better idea of possible changes to bring more students to the southern sector, as well as the fact on seeing truly a better picture of how after COVID we're going with our numbers here, as we're slowly getting out of it.
Thank you, trustees. I think we've been around the horn on this one. If you don't agree with me, say so. But I think it's time to call the question. Any disagreement on that? Then I am calling the question then, please. Please cast your ballot online.
John, could you repeat the motion, please, for us all? Chair John?
The whole thing, or just the
whatever we're going to vote on.
Okay. Here we go. Are you ready? Whereas there are 3 elementary schools under the Upper Canada District School Board in the Kemptville area, namely Kemptville Public School, South Branch Elementary School, and Oxford on Rideau Public School. And whereas on March 23rd, 2017, the Board of Trustees for the Upper Canada District School Board approved a motion to close and/or consolidate a number of elementary schools, which included a resolution to close Oxford on Rideau Public School, effective September 2018. subject to making space available at South Branch Elementary School. And whereas the grade 7 and 8 students formerly at South Branch have now been relocated to North Grenville District High School, so that there is space available at South Branch as contemplated in the board's March 2017 resolution. And whereas the Ministry of Education recommends a school should only be subject to accommodation review once in a 5-year period, unless there are circumstances determined by the school board, such as a significant change in enrollment. And whereas the Board of Trustees has received a staff report confirming that the population growth in the Kemptville area has increased at a more rapid pace than was projected in 2017. Therefore, be it resolved that the Board of Trustees approve a stay on the implementation of the closure of Oxford-on-Rideau Public School for 1 school year to September 2023, pending further consideration of the staff report presented on January 26, 2022, and public consultation on the contents of the report. Is that clear?
Thank you.
Then I would ask trustees to cast your ballot, please.
I don't see my ballot.
Trustee Barry, would you like to verbally state your vote?
No, I'd like my ballot, please.
It should be.
Has it been sent out?
Yes, it has, and the trustees have voted.
Okay. I'll abstain.
You're abstaining? Okay.
Abstain.
Chair McAllister, that motion carries.
Thank you. At this point, our meeting is concluded. I have a motion. It's moved by Trustee McDonald, seconded by
Chair. Excuse me, Chair. Was there not a second motion that went with that one?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You were very right. My apologies. The second motion is, be it further resolved that on or before March 9, 2022, the director bring a report to the Board of Trustees outlining a proposed public consultation process to be completed by no later than June 30th, 2022. Any questions or comments? Seeing none, I would ask you to cast your ballot, please.
Just clarification, what's the consultation for?
It reads as follows: be it further resolved that on or before March 19, 2022. This is associated, Trustee McDonald, with the previous motion, but I decided to split it, frankly. So be it resolved that on or before March 9th, 2022, the director bring a report to the Board of Trustees outlining a proposed public consultation process to be completed by no later than June 30th, 2022.
So I guess I'm not understanding. We've just voted in favor to let it stay open for 1 more year, but we're going to have a public consultation to do what?
So, a question as soon as you deal with Trustee McDonald.
Okay, well, let's deal with Trustee McDonald's question first. Trustee Swan, this is your motion. Would you care to comment on this?
Well, because of staffing, we still need to do staffing, and so I picked this date on the recommendations of our council, and To get the information, further information, we have to do a public consultation because of the complexity of this and that it was closed in with other motions. With other schools, we're in the same motion, so this is making it aside, and we're just doing the public consultation on Oxford on Rideau, based on the advice of the board lawyer.
I don't think that's germane to what we just passed. We've given it a 1-year moratorium, and now you're asking for a consultation that it really doesn't logically make sense. We've just said it's not going to close this year. We're going to examine it next year, potentially. And there is no reason to have a consultation in my mind.
We need to have a consultation so we can possibly remove it totally from the closure list. Because if without doing that, it could be taken to a judicial review. So I can't remove it from the closure list, even on the recommendations of staff or further recommendations of trustees, unless we consult with the public on this specific school alone.
Mr. Chair, I'll leave it to you. I don't think it's germane to what we just decided. It seems a little counterproductive to what we just did as far as business for the board.
May I have a question, Mr. Chair?
Yes, just a moment, please. I'm thinking about this. Director Ferguson, as Secretary of the Board, you were in discussions with legal counsel. What is your input on this?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so when this issue was raised, as I said when I was responding to Trustee McPherson's inquiry, it's fairly new territory, and usually these don't go on this long. When the questions were asked, if it was the will of the board to overturn their previous motion and to keep the school open, I reached out to our legal counsel and was advised that it's no small undertaking to do this, and that there are certain steps that have to happen in the process, and that if you are, as a board of trustees, wanting to consider reversing the decision, now or in the future, there are certain things that you would need to do, and one of those things would be to have a public consultation around it. The recommendation was that you wouldn't want to decide after having gone through the process before and had public consultation to take this decision without at least going back again to the public to hear their thoughts on this. So it was the recommendation of legal counsel that at some point in this process, and certainly before a decision was made to have the school remain open indefinitely, or to remove the previous motion, that a public consultation would be one part of that process. When that part is done is obviously up to the board, but certainly it's at some point, if there's going to be eventually a motion to have the school be off the closure list, that public consultation would need to be part of that process.
So I believe it is my call at this point to determine whether or not this motion is germane to the previous discussion. Honestly, I was part of that discussion with our legal counsel, and I don't pretend to be an expert in these matters, but her recommendation to us was a very strong one at that point on this issue. So I'm going to rule that it is germane. There was another question there. Was it Trustee McPherson?
Thanks,
Trustee McRae?
John McRae.
Yeah.
Thanks. Well, since 3 of my elementary schools have this dagger held over their heads, well, I'd like to, and this is very germane, if this is necessary, I would like to know the status and how that affects the three of my 5 schools that are in this situation.
Point of privilege, Mr. Chair. We're talking about one particular school. This was brought forward as a notice. It's not to be added to the agenda at the 11th hour for additional schools.
Trustee McDonald, that is exactly what my response would have been, so thank you. So Trustee McCray, I'm sorry, if you want to bring it up at a later time, that's fine, but not now.
Oh, it's out there.
Just a point of clarification.
Go ahead, Trustee McPherson.
Thank you. Our first motion, essentially what we've done, is a repetition of what we've done at least twice before, and that we've hit the pause button until we have determined that we have sufficient space. According to the report tonight, we have just enough space if we go ahead with it, but we've already decided to hit the pause button. If we go with the second motion, essentially what you're asking for is the family of schools boundary review in the Kempville district. Is that my interpretation, or are we talking about something else?
I believe we're talking about something else. This does not preclude a boundary review, but does not mandate a boundary review.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions?
Mr. Chair, can I get clarification?
Yes, please, go ahead.
So if we've decided to postpone the actions of for Oxford and Rideau till next year, the purpose of consultation is, correct me if I'm wrong, is if we were declaring a motion to keep it open, which would require that if our actions are to just keep it open for one additional year, there, we saw or heard information tonight that really didn't reflect to us that there's a major change. And then the reason we've been hitting pause is because the community and Trustee Swan have asked us to do that, to see if there's any opportunities for these things to occur in the school to get additional students. I'm not quite certain that that we need to move forward with a consultation at this point. I think if individuals were wanting to go to Oxford and Rideau, they would have. So having a consultation is really premature in my mind, because we haven't decided to keep the school open in perpetuity. We've only decided to keep the school open for an additional year, and it doesn't really change the original intent of the motion that was passed in 2017. So I won't be in favor of this part.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions or comments? Trustees, I'm going to ask you to cast your ballots, please.
Chair McAllister, Trustee Swan has moved the motion. I do not have a second at this point in time.
Thank you. Is there a mover of seconder of that second motion?
I'll be happy to again.
Thank you, Trustee Strait. So we now have a seconder, so I'm asking trustees if you would cast your ballot. Thank you. I do not see a ballot yet.
Chair McAllister, other trustees have voted.
Oh.
Would you like to state your vote verbally, or wait for the vote to pop up on your screen?
I'll state my vote verbally. I'm in favor of the motion. Is there anyone else whose vote is not taken?
No, all votes have been received and the motion has been defeated.
Okay. Thank you. We are now moving, I guess, to adjournment. I have a motion moved by Trustee McDonald, I believe it was, and Trustee McCray, with the regular meeting in the public session of the Upper Canada District School Board, January 26, 2022, be adjourned at 9:42, and the next regular meeting will take place on February 9th, 2022. I want to thank everyone, staff in particular, and trustees also for your participation in this meeting and your wise counsel, and we will now adjourn. So thank you so much. Good night, everyone.
Be safe. Stay well.
Take care, everyone.